If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Michael Reynolds, and I've always thought of myself as an ordinary guy. I'm 32 years old, single, and work as a wildlife researcher. It's not exactly a glamorous job, but I've always loved nature. The quiet, the peace, the feeling of being far away from the chaos of the world. That's probably why I took this assignment in the first place. It all started when my boss called me into his office one rainy afternoon. He said they needed someone to monitor wildlife activity in a remote forest up north. The area was part of a protected reserve, and there had been reports of unusual animal behavior, disappearances, strange migration patterns, stuff like that. He said it would only be for 2 weeks, and I'd be staying in a small observation cabin deep in the woods. It sounded simple enough. 2 weeks alone in the wilderness, no problem. I'd done similar assignments before, so I packed my gear and set out early the next morning. The drive to the forest took nearly 8 hours. As I got closer, the roads became narrower and bumpier, and eventually I had to park my truck at a ranger station and hike the rest of the way to the cabin. The forest was dense. Tall pine trees stretched high into the sky, their branches blocking out most of the sunlight. It was quiet too, eerily quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just silence. When I finally reached the cabin, it was already late afternoon. The place was small but sturdy, a single room with a bed, a desk, a wood stove for heat, and a small radio for communication. There was no electricity or running water, just a few solar-powered lights and a rainwater collection system outside. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it would do. As I unpacked my things and settled in, I couldn't shake this strange feeling that something was off. Maybe it was just the isolation, or the fact that I hadn't seen another human being since leaving the ranger station. Or maybe it was because of what happened next. While setting up my equipment, a pair of binoculars, a camera, and some motion-activated wildlife trackers, I noticed something odd outside the cabin window. At first, I thought it was just shadows from the trees swaying in the wind, but then I realized there wasn't any wind. The air was completely still. I stepped outside to take a closer look and saw what appeared to be tracks in the snow leading away from the cabin. They weren't animal tracks. They were too big for that, but they weren't human either. The footprints were long and narrow, with claw-like marks at the tips. I told myself it was probably nothing, a trick of light, or maybe even an old set of tracks distorted by melting snow. But deep down, I felt uneasy. By nightfall, I had finished setting up my equipment and logged my first observations in my notebook. No significant wildlife activity observed today. After dinner, a can of beans heated on the wood stove, I crawled into bed and tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The silence outside felt heavy, as if something was watching me from beyond the trees. Every creak of the cabin's wooden walls made me jump, and every gust of wind sounded like whispers. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off into an uneasy sleep filled with strange dreams. Dreams of shadows moving through the forest and whispers calling my name. When I woke up the next morning, I found something on my doorstep that made my blood run cold. A single claw mark etched into the wooden frame of the door. When I saw the claw mark on the door, I froze. It wasn't deep, just a scratch, but it was enough to make my stomach churn. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it could have been anything, a bear maybe, or some other animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't normal. I'd seen claw marks before during my work in the field, and this one didn't match anything I'd ever come across. I decided to brush it off. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The second day started quietly enough. I spent most of the morning hiking through the forest, checking on the motion-activated trackers I'd set up around the cabin. The trackers are simple devices. They snap photos whenever something moves in front of them. They're great for monitoring wildlife without disturbing their natural behavior, but as I checked each tracker, I noticed something strange. The first few had no photos at all, just blank frames, as if nothing had passed by. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes animals avoid certain areas, but when I reached the last tracker, my heart skipped a beat. The photo showed something. At first glance, it looked like a blur, just a dark shape moving through the trees. But when I zoomed in on the image, I could see faint outlines. Long limbs, hunched shoulders, and glowing eyes that seemed to stare directly at the camera. I stared at the photo for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of it. It didn't look like any animal I'd ever studied. It didn't even look human. It was something else entirely. I decided not to dwell on it too much. Maybe the camera malfunctioned or caught a trick of light, something explainable. Still, my gut told me otherwise. That night, as I sat by the wood stove eating dinner, I heard something outside, faint footsteps crunching in the snow. My heart started pounding as I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and snow. The footsteps stopped as soon as I stepped outside, and there was no sign of movement anywhere. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. Then I saw them, the tracks. They were fresh and led away from the cabin into the woods. They looked just like the ones I'd seen yesterday, long and narrow with claw-like marks at the tips. I didn't follow them. Something told me not to. Yet the third day was worse. I woke up early to check my equipment again, but found one of my trackers smashed to pieces near the edge of a clearing. The wires were torn apart as if something had ripped them out with brute force. As I crouched down to examine it, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye, something darting between the trees about 50 feet away. It was fast, too fast, for me to get a good look, but it was big. I stood up quickly and scanned the area with my binoculars, but saw nothing except shadows shifting between branches. By now, my nerves were shot. Every sound made me jump. The creak of a tree branch, the rustle of leaves in the wind, it all felt wrong somehow. That night was even worse than before. As soon as darkness fell, strange noises began echoing through the forest. Low growls mixed with high-pitched screeches that sounded almost human, but not quite. I stayed inside with all the lights on and kept my radio close by in case I needed help. But no one answered when I tried calling for backup. Not even static came through. At some point during the night, I heard scratching at one of the windows. A slow, deliberate sound, like claws dragging across glass. When I finally worked up enough courage to look outside, there was nothing there, just empty darkness staring back at me. By morning, my nerves were shot completely. Something was out there, I didn't know what, but it wasn't normal wildlife behavior anymore. Whatever this thing was, it felt like it was watching me, and somehow, it felt like it wanted me to know that it was there. The morning of the fourth day started with a heavy fog. It rolled through the forest like a thick gray blanket, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The air felt damp and cold, and the silence was as unsettling as ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, even though I couldn't see or hear anything. I spent most of the morning inside the cabin, trying to make sense of everything that had happened so far. The claw marks, the strange tracks, the smashed equipment, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't put together. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a bear behaving oddly, or maybe I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Around noon, I heard something unusual. Faint at first, but growing louder. It was the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow, coming from somewhere near the edge of the clearing. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. For a moment there was no response. Then, through the fog, I saw a figure stumbling toward me. It was a woman, bundled up in a thick coat and scarf, her face pale and her movements unsteady. "Help," she said weakly as she collapsed into the snow. I rushed over to her and helped her inside the cabin. She was shivering uncontrollably, her clothes damp from the cold. After wrapping her in a blanket and giving her some hot tea, she finally started to calm down enough to speak. Her name was Dr. Emily Hayes. She said she was an environmental scientist studying climate patterns in the area. According to her, she'd been part of a research team stationed about 10 miles away from my cabin, but when a sudden storm hit 2 days ago, she got separated from her group while out collecting data. "I've been wandering through the forest ever since," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought I was going to freeze to death out there." Her story seemed plausible enough, but something about it didn't sit right with me. For one thing, I hadn't seen any signs of other people in the area, not even footprints leading to my cabin. And for another, she seemed scared of something more than just being lost in the woods. "What happened to your team?" I asked. And carefully, she hesitated for a moment before answering. I don't know," she said finally. "We were supposed to meet back at base camp after the storm passed, but when I got there, no one was there." Her eyes darted toward the window as she spoke, as if expecting something or someone to appear outside. I decided not to press her further for now. She looked exhausted and terrified enough as it was. That night, we sat by the wood stove in silence for a long time before she finally spoke again. "Have you noticed anything strange out here?" she asked hesitantly. I hesitated before answering. "What do you mean? Like noises? Tracks? Things that don't make sense?" Her words sent a chill down my spine. "Why do you ask?" I said cautiously. She glanced toward the window again before lowering her voice. "Because I've seen things," she whispered. "Things that shouldn't be possible." She went on to describe strange occurrences during her research. Equipment malfunctioning without explanation, animals behaving erratically, and shadowy figures moving through the trees at night. "At first, I thought it was just stress or lack of sleep," she said. "But then, one night, I saw it." "Saw what?" I asked. She looked at me with wide eyes filled with fear. "I don't know what it was," she said quietly. "But it wasn't human." As much as I wanted to dismiss her story as paranoia or hallucination brought on by exhaustion, part of me couldn't help but believe her, especially after everything I'd experienced over the past few days. That night was one of the longest nights of my life. The fog outside made it impossible to see anything beyond the cabin walls, and every little sound set my nerves on edge. Dr. Hayes stayed close to me, clutching her tea mug like it was a lifeline. At some point during the night, we heard it again, the scratching sound at one of the windows. This time, it was louder and more deliberate than before. Neither of us dared to look outside. By morning, we were both exhausted, but relieved to see daylight again, even if it didn't feel much safer than the night had been. Something was out. There, something neither of us could explain, and we both knew it wasn't going away anytime soon. The morning after Dr. Hayes arrived, we decided to focus on figuring out what was going on. Neither of us wanted to admit it out loud, but we both knew something wasn't right. The claw marks, the tracks, the noises, they weren't normal. And whatever was out there wasn't just some animal. Dr. Hayes was determined to make sense of it all. She said she'd studied strange phenomena before, things people couldn't explain, and believed there might be a scientific explanation for what we were experiencing. I wasn't so sure anymore. My gut told me this wasn't something science could explain. We spent most of the day going through her notes and equipment. She had a laptop with her, powered by a portable solar charger, and several notebooks filled with data she'd collected over the past few weeks. Her notes mentioned unusual weather patterns, sudden drops in temperature, and strange electromagnetic readings in the area. "It's like the forest is alive," she said at one point, frowning at her notes. "Not in the way you'd expect. Though, it's almost like it's reacting to something." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. Later that afternoon, I decided to check the motion trackers again, while Dr. Hayes stayed behind to analyze her data. As I made my way through the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees seemed darker than usual, their shadows stretching unnaturally across the snow. When I reached the first tracker, I found it intact, but empty. No photos, no signs of movement. The second tracker was the same. But when I got to the third, and my heart sank, the camera had been ripped off its mount and smashed into pieces. The snow around it was disturbed, as if something had been thrashing around violently, and there were tracks, fresh ones, leading deeper into the woods. I didn't follow them. When I returned to the cabin, Dr. Hayes was staring at her laptop with a puzzled expression. "Look at this," she said, turning the screen toward me. It showed a map of the area with several markers indicating electromagnetic anomalies she'd recorded over the past few weeks. The markers formed a pattern, a spiral that seemed to center around our location. "It's not random," she said quietly. "Whatever's happening here, it's focused on this area." Her words made my stomach churn. That night, we heard more noises outside. Growls mixed with screeches that sounded almost human, but not quite. Dr. Hayes tried to record them using her equipment, but couldn't get a clear signal. At one point during the night, we heard footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever it was wanted us to know they were there. Neither of us slept much that night. The next day brought more unsettling discoveries. While hiking through the forest to set up new motion trackers, we stumbled across an old campsite hidden among the trees. The tents were torn apart and covered in snow, and there were personal belongings scattered everywhere, backpacks, sleeping bags, even a few notebooks filled with handwritten entries. Dr. Hayes picked up one of the notebooks and flipped through it quickly before stopping on a page near the middle. "This is from another research team," she said quietly. "They were studying wildlife migration patterns in this area last year." She handed me the notebook, and I read through some of the entries. Day 3. Strange noises at night. Sounds like growling mixed with whispers. Day 5. Found tracks. Near camp. Long and narrow with claw marks. Day 7. Something is watching us. The final entry sent chills down my spine. Day 10. It's here. Dr. Hayes looked shaken as she put down the notebook and glanced around nervously. "What happened to them?" she asked softly. I didn't have an answer. That evening, as we sat by the wood stove trying to make sense of everything we'd found, Dr. Hayes brought up something else, something I hadn't considered before. "There are legends about places like this," she said cautiously. "Stories passed down by indigenous tribes about creatures that live in remote forests." "What kind of creatures?" I asked hesitantly. She hesitated before answering. "Wendigos," she said finally. I frowned at her in confusion. "Wendigos? What are those?" "They're part of Native American folklore," she explained. "Spirits, or creatures that are said to haunt forests during winter months. Hunters turned into monsters by greed or desperation." Her words made my skin crawl. "You don't think—" I started but couldn't finish my sentence. "I don't know," she admitted quietly, "but whatever's out there, it feels like it's more than just an animal." By nightfall, we were both on edge again as more noises echoed through the forest. The same growls and screeches mixed with whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It felt like whatever was out there was getting closer and bolder with each passing day. By the 7th day, The tension in the cabin was unbearable. Dr. Hayes and I barely spoke anymore, and every little sound outside made us jump. The forest didn't feel like a peaceful place anymore. It felt alive, like it was breathing, watching, waiting. That evening, the temperature dropped sharply, even colder than it had been before. The cabin walls creaked under the weight of the icy wind, and frost began to form on the windows. Dr. Hayes sat at the desk, scribbling notes furiously while I paced back and forth, trying to calm my nerves. "I think it's trying to scare us," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Stopped pacing and looked at her. "What do you mean?" She turned to face me, her expression serious. "Whatever's out there, it's not just hunting us, it's playing with us. It wants us to feel trapped." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Later that night, I decided to step outside for some fresh air. The cabin felt suffocating, and I needed a moment to clear my head. Dr. Hayes tried to stop me, but I assured her I'd stay close and wouldn't be gone long. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked a few feet away from the cabin. The forest was eerily quiet. No wind, no animals, just silence. My breath formed clouds in the freezing air as I scanned the area with my flashlight. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark shape moving between the trees about 30 feet away. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. As I tried to make out what it was, the shape moved closer, stepping into the beam of my flashlight. It wasn't human. It stood tall, at least 7 feet, and its limbs were long and thin, almost skeletal. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness like two burning coals. Its face was twisted and gaunt, with sharp teeth that glinted as it opened its mouth. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare as it took another step toward me. Then it let out a sound, a low growl that turned into a high-pitched screech. The noise was so loud and unnatural that it felt like it was piercing straight through me. That snapped me. Out of my trance, I turned and ran back to the cabin as fast as I could, slamming the door shut behind me. Dr. Hayes jumped up from her seat, startled by my sudden entrance. "What happened?" she asked urgently. "It's out there," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "I saw it." Her face paled as she grabbed her notebook and pen. "What did it look like?" I described everything, the height, the glowing eyes, the twisted face, and watched as she scribbled furiously in her notebook. "This matches some of the descriptions from indigenous folklore," she said quietly when I finished speaking. "But this doesn't make sense." "What doesn't make sense?" I asked sharply. She hesitated before answering. "Wendigos are supposed to be legends, stories meant to warn people about greed and isolation during harsh winters. They're not supposed to be real." "Well," I said grimly, "it sure looked real to me." The rest of the night was a blur of fear and paranoia. Every sound outside felt like footsteps or scratching claws. Every shadow felt like something lurking just beyond our sight. At one point during the night, we heard something heavy thud against one of the cabin walls. Once, twice, before everything went silent again. Neither of us dared to look outside. Morning. We were both exhausted but relieved to see daylight again, even if it didn't feel much safer than the night had been. I knew one thing for sure. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't going away anytime soon. The morning after I saw the creature, everything felt different. The forest wasn't just quiet anymore. It was dead. No birds, no wind, not even the sound of snow falling from the trees. It was like the world had stopped moving, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Dr. Hayes and I sat at the small table in the cabin, barely touching our breakfast. Neither of us had much of an appetite. She kept flipping through her notebook, muttering things to herself about electromagnetic fields and folklore. I just stared out the window, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. "We can't. Stay here," I said finally, breaking the silence. She looked up at me, her eyes tired and bloodshot. Where would we go? Back to the ranger station, I said. It's only a few miles away. We can make it. She shook her head. You saw what's out there. Do you really think we'd make it that far without it following us? I didn't have an answer. Later that day, we decided to check the area around the cabin for anything we might have missed. Clues, tracks, anything that could help us understand what was going on. We stayed close together as we walked through. The snow, both of us on edge with every step. Near the edge of the clearing, we found something that made my stomach churn. More tracks. They were just like the ones I'd seen before, long and narrow with claw-like marks at the tips. But this time, there were more of them. A lot more. It's not alone, Dr. Hayes whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. That night was worse than any before it. The noises started just after sunset, growls, screeches, and whispers that seemed to come from all around us. At first, they were faint and distant, but as the hours passed, they grew louder and closer. Dr. Hayes tried to record them again using her equipment, but every time she hit record, the devices would malfunction. Static-filled recordings, or files that wouldn't save at all. It's like it doesn't want us to document it, Aunt, she said in frustration. At one point during the night, we heard heavy footsteps circling the cabin again, slow and deliberate like before. But this time, they didn't stop. The footsteps grew louder and louder until they were right outside the door. Then came a loud thud, like something heavy slamming against the wood. Dr. Hayes grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. What do we do? She whispered urgently. I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan, but nothing seemed good enough. Another thud shook the door, followed by a low growl that made my blood run cold. Stay quiet, I whispered back. We sat there in silence for what felt like hours, listening as whatever was outside continued to circle the cabin. At one point, it scratched at one of the windows again, slow and deliberate like before, but this time it didn't stop until dawn. By morning, we were both exhausted and terrified beyond words. The creature, or creatures, had left fresh. Claw marks on every wall of the cabin during the night, as if marking their territory or warning us to leave. But where could we go? On day 9, things took an even darker turn. While checking one of my motion trackers near the edge of the clearing, I found something that made my heart sink. A piece of torn fabric snagged on a branch. A piece of fabric that looked exactly like part of Frank Weather's jacket. Frank was another researcher who had been stationed in this area months ago. A guy I'd met briefly at a conference before he disappeared without a trace during one of his assignments here in these woods. Dr. Hayes examined the fabric carefully when I brought it back to the cabin. This doesn't make sense, she said quietly. If this is Frank's, then how long has this thing been here? I didn't want to think about it too much. That night brought another round of noises, this time louder and more aggressive than ever before. The growls turned into roars. The whispers turned into screams that sounded almost human, but not quite. At one point during the night, Dr. Hayes broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably as she clutched her notebook like it was some kind of shield against whatever was out there. I can't do this anymore, she said through tears. I can't. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay. But how could I? I didn't even believe it myself anymore. By day 10, we were both hanging by a thread, physically and mentally drained from lack of sleep and constant fear. The forest felt more hostile than ever before, as if it wanted us gone, or worse, and wanted us to stay forever. And deep down, I knew we couldn't last much longer if something didn't change soon. By the time night fell on the 10th day, the air inside the cabin felt heavier than ever. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind outside, made my heart race. Dr. Hayes sat at the desk, her hands trembling as she flipped through her notebook. I could tell she was trying to focus on her research, but it was no use. We were both too far gone, too scared, too tired. I stayed by the window, staring out into the darkness. The snow reflected just enough moonlight to make out the tree line, but beyond that, it was pitch black. I kept expecting to see something move between the trees, a shadow, a figure, but nothing came. For hours, we sat in silence, waiting for something to happen. And then, it did. It started with a sound, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around us. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then it came again, louder this time. Dr. Hayes froze in her seat. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. The growl turned into a screech, a high-pitched wail that made my ears ring and sent chills down my spine. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, inhuman and unnatural. Then came the footsteps. They were slow and heavy, crunching through the snow as they approached the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the flashlight and shined it out the window. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, there it was. The creature stood just beyond the clearing, its glowing eyes fixed on the cabin. It was even taller than I remembered, its gaunt frame towering over the snow-covered ground. Its skin looked almost translucent in the moonlight, stretched tight over its bones like a corpse brought back to life. It took a step closer, and then another. Each movement was slow and deliberate, as if it knew exactly how much fear it was causing. "We need to do something," Dr. Hayes whispered urgently. "Like what?" I shot back, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. The creature reached the edge of the clearing and stopped. For a moment, everything went silent again. No growls, no footsteps, just an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. And then it charged. It moved faster than I thought possible. One moment it was at the edge of the clearing. The next, it was slamming into the side of the cabin with enough force to make the walls shake. Dr. Hayes screamed as books and papers fell from the desk onto the floor. I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward me as another loud thud echoed through the cabin. "It's trying to get in," she cried. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob as a makeshift barricade while Dr. Hayes scrambled to gather her equipment. The creature slammed into the door again and again, each hit more violent than the last. "We can't stay here," I shouted over the noise. "Where are we supposed to go?" she yelled back. Before I could answer, there was a loud crash from one of the windows, the sound of glass shattering, followed by a low growl that sent chills down my spine. "It's inside," Dr. Hayes whispered, her face pale with terror. We backed away slowly as the creature crawled through the broken window frame and into the cabin. Up close, it looked even more horrifying than before, its glowing eyes burning with an unnatural light as its sharp claws scraped against the wooden floorboards. It let out another screech that made my ears ring before lunging toward us. I grabbed a fire poker from beside the wood stove and swung it wildly at the creature, hitting it square in its bony chest. It let out a guttural roar of pain, but didn't back down. Instead, it swiped at me with one of its claws, narrowly missing my face. Dr. Hayes grabbed a lantern from the table and threw it at the creature's head. The glass shattered on impact, spilling oil everywhere and briefly stunning it long enough for us to run toward the back of the cabin. "We need to get out of here," she shouted as we barricaded ourselves in a small storage room near the back door. "How?" I asked breathlessly. "It's right outside." She rummaged through her bag and pulled out something I hadn't seen before. A small bundle wrapped in cloth with strange symbols etched into its surface. "What is that?" I asked. "It's an artifact," she said quickly. "I found it during one of my field studies. It's supposed to ward off evil spirits." "You're telling me you've had this thing all along?" I said incredulously. "I didn't think we'd need it." She snapped back. She unwrapped the artifact, a small carved figure made of stone, and placed it on the floor between us as she muttered something under her breath that sounded like a prayer or chant. The creature let out another screech from outside, as if sensing what we were doing. It slammed into the storage room door with enough force to crack one of its hinges, but didn't break through completely. Not yet anyway. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we stayed huddled together in that tiny room as Dr. Hayes continued chanting softly under her breath while clutching onto that strange artifact like her life depended on it, which maybe it did at this point. Eventually, everything went quiet again. The growls stopped, so did footsteps, and when we finally worked up enough courage to open that door, there was no sign of anything outside except for shattered glass and claw marks everywhere, but deep down, knew wasn't over. The morning after the attack felt surreal. The cabin was a wreck, broken windows, claw marks gouged into the walls, and oil stains from the shattered lantern. Dr. Hayes and I sat on the floor, staring at the artifact she had used to ward off the creature. It was still sitting there, untouched, its strange carvings glowing faintly in the dim light. Neither of us said much. What could we say? We'd survived the night, but we both knew it wasn't over. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't gone. It was just waiting. We spent most of the day trying to patch up the cabin as best we could. I boarded up the broken window with some spare wood while Dr. Hayes organized her notes and equipment. She kept glancing at the artifact like it was some kind of lifeline, but I wasn't sure how much it could help us. "Do you think it'll come back?" I asked quietly as I hammered another plank into place. She didn't answer right away. "I don't think it ever left," she said finally. Her words sent a chill down my spine. That evening, we decided to check the area around the cabin again for any signs of movement or clues about what we were dealing with. The snow was deeper now, making it harder to walk, but we managed to make our way to the edge of the clearing. That's when we found it, the lair. It was a cave, hidden behind a cluster of trees, its entrance partially obscured by snow and ice. Tracks led straight into it, long and narrow with claw-like marks at the tips. Dr. Hayes stared at the cave for a long time before speaking. "This is where it lives," she said quietly. I didn't want to go inside, but part of me knew we had. 2. If we wanted answers, or even a chance at survival, we needed to understand what we were dealing with. The cave was dark and cold, its walls covered in frost that sparkled faintly in the beam of my flashlight. The air smelled damp and rotten, like something had been decaying inside for a long time. As we moved deeper into the cave, we started to see things. Bones scattered across the floor, bits of torn clothing frozen into the ice, and strange symbols carved into the walls that looked similar to those on Dr. Hayes's artifact. "This isn't just a lair," she said softly. "It's something else." "What do you mean?" I asked. She pointed to one of the carvings on the wall, a spiral pattern surrounded by jagged lines. "These symbols, they're part of indigenous rituals meant to summon or bind spirits." "Bind spirits?" I repeated uneasily. She nodded. "I think this creature was summoned here, and now it's trapped." Her words made my stomach churn. At the back of the cave, we found something even more horrifying, a pile of corpses frozen into the ice. Some were animals, deer, wolves, but others were human. Their faces were twisted in expressions of terror, their bodies preserved like grotesque statues. Dr. Hayes covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with shock. "This is why people keep disappearing," she whispered. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at those frozen faces and wonder if we'd end up like them. We left the cave quickly after that, both of us too shaken to stay any longer. As we stepped out into the snow-covered forest, Dr. Hayes turned to me with a determined look on her face. "We have to stop it," she said firmly. "How?" I asked helplessly. She held up her artifact again. "This might be our only chance." That night was worse than any before it. The creature returned just after sunset, scratching at the walls and growling loudly enough to make my ears ring. It didn't try to break in right away. It seemed to be testing us, waiting for something. Dr. Hayes clutched her artifact tightly as she muttered another chant under her breath. I stayed by her side, holding onto a fire poker, like it would somehow protect me from whatever was outside. Then came another loud crash, the sound of wood splintering as one of our barricades gave way. The creature forced its way inside through a small opening near the back door, its glowing eyes burning with rage as it let out another ear-piercing screech. Dr. Hayes threw herself in front of me, holding up her artifact like a shield as she shouted something in a language I didn't understand. The creature hesitated for a moment, its glowing eyes flickering, but then lunged toward her anyway. I swung my fire poker wildly, hitting it in the side and knocking it off balance long enough for us to run toward the basement door. "Go!" Dr. Hayes shouted as she pushed me inside and slammed the door shut behind us. The basement was cold and dark, its walls lined with old shelves filled with canned goods and tools left behind by previous researchers who had stayed in this cabin years ago. We barricaded ourselves inside again as best we could, while Dr. Hayes continued chanting softly under her breath, with tears streaming down her face. Eventually, everything went quiet again. The growls stopped, so did footsteps, and when we finally worked up enough courage to open that door, there was no sign of anything outside except for shattered glass and claw marks everywhere. But deep down, new wasn't over. The morning of the 12th day felt like the calm before a storm. The air was still, the forest silent, and the cabin eerily quiet. Dr. Hayes and I both knew what had to happen. We couldn't keep running or hiding. If we wanted to survive, we had to face the creature and stop it for good. Dr. Hayes spent most of the morning preparing. She gathered her notes, the artifact, and a few supplies she thought might help. Matches, a knife, and a small vial of liquid she said was used in indigenous rituals. I didn't ask too many questions. At this point, I trusted her instincts, more than my own. Meanwhile, I focused on creating makeshift weapons. A sharpened stick, a heavy wrench from the basement, and a few cans of oil I could use as fire starters. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "We need to lure it back to the cave," Dr. Hayes said, as she packed her bag. "Why the cave?" I asked. She pointed to her notebook, where she'd sketched one of the symbols we'd seen on the cave walls. "These markings, they're meant to bind spirits. If we can get it back there and use the artifact, we might be able to trap it." "And if that doesn't work?" I asked hesitantly. She looked at me with tired eyes. "Then we fight." We left the cabin just before sunset, moving cautiously through the snow-covered forest toward the cave. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the weight of what we were about to do was pressing down on us. The forest was darker than usual, even though there was still some daylight left. The trees seemed taller and closer together, their shadows stretching across the ground like long fingers. I kept my flashlight trained ahead while Dr. Hayes clutched the artifact tightly in her hands. When we reached the cave, we stopped just outside the entrance to catch our breath. The air was colder here, biting at my skin even through my thick coat. "Are you ready?" Dr. Hayes asked quietly. I nodded, gripping my makeshift spear tightly. "Let's do this." We stepped inside the cave slowly, our footsteps echoing off. The icy walls. The lair looked just as horrifying as before. Bones scattered across the floor, frozen corpses embedded in the ice, and those strange symbols carved into every surface. Dr. Hayes placed the artifact in the center of the cave and began chanting softly under her breath. Her voice was steady, but filled with urgency as she repeated words I couldn't understand. For a moment, everything was quiet, too quiet, and then it came. The creature appeared at the entrance of the cave, its glowing eyes burning brighter than ever as it let out a deafening screech. It moved slowly at first, its long limbs scraping against the walls as it crawled toward us. I raised my spear and took a step forward, trying to block its path to Dr. Hayes. "Stay back!" I shouted. It didn't listen. The creature lunged at me with its claws outstretched, forcing me to dive out of the way. My spear grazed its side, but didn't seem to hurt it much. It barely flinched before turning its attention back to Dr. Hayes. She continued chanting loudly now, her voice echoing through the cave as she held up her vial of liquid and poured it onto the artifact. The carvings on its surface began to glow brighter and brighter until they lit up the entire cave with an eerie blue light. The creature roared in anger and lunged toward her again, but this time something stopped it. The symbols on the walls began glowing too, forming a spiral pattern that seemed to trap the creature in place. It thrashed violently against an invisible force field, letting out guttural growls and screeches that made my ears ring. "It's working!" Dr. Hayes shouted over the noise. But then something changed. The creature's glowing eyes flickered for a moment before burning even brighter than before, so bright that I had to shield my face from the light. It let out one final roar and broke free from whatever was holding it back. "No!" Dr. Hayes screamed as it lunged toward her again. I acted on instinct, grabbing one of my oil cans and throwing it at the creature with all my strength before lighting a match and tossing it after. The flames erupted instantly, engulfing its skeletal frame in fire. The creature let out a horrifying screech as it thrashed wildly against the flames before collapsing onto the floor in a heap of ash and smoke. For a moment, everything went silent again, except for our heavy breathing. Dr. Hayes dropped to her knees beside me, clutching onto her artifact like it was her lifeline once more. "Is it gone?" I asked hesitantly. She nodded slowly, but didn't say anything, her face pale with exhaustion and relief all at once. As we stepped outside into fresh snow-covered clearing, New had survived battle, but scars would never fade. The morning after the confrontation in the cave felt unreal. The forest was quiet again, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that made you feel small, like the world was holding its breath. Dr. Hayes and I walked back to the cabin in silence, both of us too exhausted to speak. Every step felt heavier than the last, and my body ached from head to toe. When we reached the cabin, it looked even more battered than before. The broken windows, claw marks, and scattered debris were reminders of everything we'd been through. But for the first time in days, I didn't feel like something was watching me. The air felt lighter. Dr. Hayes sat down at the desk and started writing in her notebook while I began cleaning up the mess. Neither of us said much. There wasn't much to say. We were alive, and that was enough for now. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's glowing eyes staring back at me. I kept hearing its screeches, echoing in my head, and every creak of the cabin made my heart race. Around midnight, I got up and went outside for some air. The snow was falling lightly, covering the ground in a fresh white blanket. The forest looked almost peaceful under the moonlight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. I stood there for a long time, staring at the tree line and listening to the silence. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light, but as I squinted into the darkness, I realized it wasn't. It was a figure standing just beyond the clearing, watching me. My heart started pounding as I backed away slowly toward the cabin, but when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, that my mind was playing tricks on me after everything we'd been through, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next day, Dr. Hayes and I packed up our things and prepared to leave. We'd radioed for help earlier that morning, and a ranger team was on their way to pick us up. Neither of us wanted to stay in that cabin any longer than we had to. As we waited for the rangers to arrive, Dr. Hayes handed me her notebook. "Here," she said quietly. "Take this." I frowned at her in confusion. "Why?" "Because someone needs to know what happened here," she said firmly. "Someone needs to tell this story." I hesitated before taking the notebook from her hands. "What about you?" I asked. She gave me a small, tired smile. I think I've had enough of this place. When the rangers arrived later that afternoon, we didn't say much about what had happened. We told them about strange animal behavior and equipment malfunctions, but left out anything about the creature or the cave. Who would believe us anyway? As we drove away from the forest, I couldn't help but look back one last time at the tree line, disappearing into the distance. Part of me felt relieved to be leaving it all behind, but another part of me felt like it wasn't over. Even now, weeks later, I still can't shake that feeling, that sense that something is still out there in those woods, watching and waiting. I've tried to move on with my life, to go back to work and pretend like nothing happened, but it's not that simple. Every time I close my eyes, I see those glowing eyes staring back at me, and sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers in the wind calling my name. My name is Victoria Navarro, but everyone calls me Vicky. I'm a park ranger stationed at Hollow Creek Wilderness Preserve, a place that's as beautiful as it is terrifying. It's 1986, midwinter, and the snow has buried the entire landscape like a thick white blanket. The trees stand tall and lifeless, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air is so cold it bites your skin, and the silence, it's not peaceful. It's heavy, like the forest is holding its breath. I've been here for about 2 years now, but this winter feels different. There's something about Hollow Creek that makes people uneasy. Maybe it's the stories, the ones whispered around campfires and passed down by locals. Stories about strange shadows moving in the woods, howls that don't belong to wolves, and people who vanish without a trace. My dad was one of those people. He disappeared here when I was 10 years old. No body was ever found, just his journal, left behind in a cabin deep in the wilderness. That journal is why I'm here now. It's why I chose this job, this place. I thought maybe I could find answers or closure, but instead, I've found more questions. The preserve is huge, stretching, miles in every direction, with dense forests, frozen rivers, and rocky cliffs that seem to go on forever. It's remote too. No cell service, no nearby towns, and during winter storms like this one, even the roads are impassable. We're completely cut off from the outside world until spring thaw or rescue teams arrive. I'm not alone out here. There's Ranger Michael Odiambo, who's been here longer than me and knows every trail like the back of his hand. Dr. Eleanor Whitefeather, an anthropologist studying indigenous legends. Sheriff Robert Keller, who checks in occasionally to investigate missing persons cases, and Garrett Wilson, a wildlife expert who showed up last week claiming to study predators in the area. Something about him feels off. The first sign that something wasn't right came last week when Michael found a mutilated deer near one of the trails. Its body was torn apart in ways I've never seen before, like something had attacked it but didn't eat it. Then there were the tracks, huge prints in the snow that looked like they belonged to a wolf but were too large and too deep for any known species around here. And then there were the noises, howls echoing through the forest at night, long and mournful, but also intelligent. It sounds crazy even saying it out loud, but it feels like they're communicating with each other, or with us. I've started keeping my own journal now, just like my dad did all those years ago. Maybe it'll help me make sense of what's happening, or maybe it'll be all that's left of me if something goes wrong. The snowstorm had finally eased up, but the cold was still unbearable. I pulled my coat tighter around me as I stepped out of the ranger station. The air smelled sharp, like ice and pine needles. The world was quiet, except for the crunch of snow under my boots. It felt like the forest was watching me. Michael and I were on patrol together that morning. He's a tall guy with a calm demeanor, the kind of person who doesn't scare easily. But even he seemed uneasy lately. We were checking the trails near where he'd found that mutilated deer last week. "Vicky," Michael said, his voice low, "look at this." He pointed at the ground. There were tracks in the snow, huge ones like before. They looked like wolf prints, but they were spaced out strangely, like whatever made them was walking upright. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. What kind of animal walks like this? I asked, trying to sound calm. Michael didn't answer right away. He crouched down and ran his fingers over the edge of one print. I don't know, he finally said. But it's not normal. We followed the tracks for about a mile before they suddenly stopped, just vanished into thin air. No sign of whatever made them, no trail leading away, nothing. It was like the creature had just disappeared. Later that afternoon, Dr. Eleanor Whitefeather joined us at the station. She's an older woman with sharp eyes and a quiet way of speaking that makes you listen closely to every word she says. She's been studying indigenous legends for years, and she knows more about Hollow Creek than anyone else I've met. When we told her about the tracks, she didn't seem surprised. Instead, she nodded slowly and said, "It sounds like what some tribes call skin changers." Skin changers? Michael asked, raising an eyebrow. "They're beings that can shift between human and animal form," Eleanor explained. "Not quite human, not quite beast, something in between." Her voice was calm, but there was a weight to her words that made my stomach tighten. I wanted to dismiss it as folklore, just another scary story people tell to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. But after seeing those tracks and hearing those howls, I wasn't so sure anymore. That night, Garrett Wilson came back to the station with something strange, an audio recording he'd taken near his campsite. He played it for us on a small tape recorder, and as soon as the sound filled the room, I felt my chest tighten. The recording started with normal forest sounds, wind through the trees, distant rustling, but then came the howl. It wasn't like any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard before. It was deep and guttural at first, but then shifted into something higher pitched and almost human-like. It sounded like it was trying to say something, but not in any language I recognized. "What do you think it is?" Garrett asked casually. But there was a strange look in his eyes. Like the next few days were worse than I expected. The snowstorm came back with a vengeance, cutting us off completely from the outside world. No roads, no radio signals, nothing. It was just us, the forest, and whatever was out there. Michael and I decided to check the area around Garrett's campsite. He'd been staying near the edge of the preserve, close to where those strange tracks had been found. When we got there, the scene was unsettling. His tent was still standing, but everything around it felt wrong. The snow was disturbed in odd patterns, circles and lines that didn't make sense. It wasn't like someone had walked through. It was more like something had dragged itself across the ground. And then there was the smell, like wet fur and something rotting. "Garrett?" Michael called out, his voice steady but tense. No answer. We found his camera in the tent, sitting on top of his sleeping bag. The battery was dead, but when we brought it back to the station and plugged it in, the images we found chilled me to the bone. The first few photos were normal, shots of trees, snow-covered trails and wildlife. But then came the last few pictures. They were blurry, taken at night, but you could see something in them, something tall and dark with glowing eyes. In one photo, it looked like it was standing upright, staring right at the camera. "What is this?" I whispered, my hands trembling as I flipped through the images. Michael shook his head slowly. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but it's not a wolf." That evening, I decided to look through my dad's old journal again. It was filled with notes about Hollow Creek, maps he'd drawn, lists of animals he'd seen, but toward the end of the journal, his writing changed. It became frantic, almost paranoid. He wrote about hearing voices in the woods and seeing shadows that moved too fast to be human or animal. One entry stood out. "They're watching me now. I don't think I'll make it out." I closed the journal and stared at the wall for a long time, trying to push down the fear rising in my chest. By now, everyone at the station was on edge. Dr. Whitefeather spent most of her time researching old legends and rituals that might explain what we were dealing with. Sheriff Keller stopped by with news that a snowmobiler had gone missing near the preserve's northern boundary, and all they'd found was blood in the snow. Whatever's. Oh, there, Keller said grimly. It's dangerous. Garrett Wilson hadn't come back yet either, which only made things worse. His behavior had always been strange, too curious about things that didn't seem important. But now his disappearance felt like another piece of this terrifying puzzle. Tatus howls started again that night, louder this time and closer than ever before. They echoed through the trees like a warning, or maybe a challenge, and every time they stopped, the silence felt heavier than before. I stayed awake long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring out the window at the dark forest beyond. My dad's journal sat open on my desk beside me, his words running through my mind over and over. They're watching me now. For the first time since I came here, I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake coming to Hollow Creek. If some questions are better left unanswered. The next morning, Michael and I decided to head out again. We couldn't just sit around waiting for something to happen. Garrett was still missing, and the howls from the night before were too close for comfort. The storm had calmed down a bit, but the sky was still gray and heavy, like it was holding back something worse. Let's check the ridge trail, Michael suggested as we geared up. If Garrett's still out there, he might have tried to find higher ground. I nodded, though my stomach churned at the thought of what we might find. We hiked in silence for most of the way, the only sounds being the crunch of snow under our boots and the occasional groan of trees swaying in the wind. The forest felt wrong. It wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. No birds, no rustling animals, nothing. About an hour into our hike, we found something that made my heart stop. A tree near the trail had deep claw marks running down its trunk, like something huge had raked its claws across it. The marks were fresh. The wood underneath was still, raw and pale. What could have done this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Michael didn't answer right away. He just stared at the tree with a look I'd never seen on his face before. Fear. Finally, he said, I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not scared of us. We kept moving, but my nerves were shot by then. Every shadow looked like it was moving. Every sound made me jump. And then we heard it, a low growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Did you hear that? I whispered, gripping my flashlight tighter. Michael nodded, his hand hovering over his holstered pistol. Stay close, he said quietly. The growl came again, louder this time. And then a shape darted between the trees ahead of us, too fast to make out clearly, but definitely not human. It was tall and dark, moving on two legs, but hunched over like an animal ready to pounce. Run! Michael shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me back down the trail. We ran as fast as we could, slipping on the snow and ice, but too terrified to stop. The growling followed us, getting closer with every step until it felt like it was right behind us. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. But I could feel it there, watching us, chasing us. When we finally made it back to the station, we slammed the door shut behind us and bolted it tight. Dr. Whitefeather and Sheriff Keller were already there, their faces pale when they saw how shaken we were. What happened? Keller demanded. There's something out there, Michael said between gasps for breath. Something big. Dr. Whitefeather didn't look surprised. Instead, she looked worried. I told you, she said quietly. This land has a history. What kind of history? I asked. She hesitated for a moment before answering. Legends about creatures that walk between worlds, neither fully human nor fully animal. That's just stories, Keller said gruffly, though he didn't sound convinced. Is it? Dr. Whitefeather shot back sharply. That night was worse than any before it. The howls came again, not just one this time, but several, overlapping each other like some kind of twisted chorus. They were closer than ever before, so close that I swore I could feel them vibrating in my chest. Michael tried to calm everyone down, but even he seemed rattled after what we'd seen earlier. "We need to figure out what's going on here," he said firmly, but no one had any answers. Not Dr. Whitefeather with her legends, or Keller with his gun, or me with my dad's journal, full of half-finished thoughts and cryptic warnings. All I knew was that whatever was out there wasn't going to stop, and neither were we. The next morning, I sat at the small desk in my room staring at my dad's journal. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. I'd read it so many times before, but now, after what Michael and I had seen in the woods, his words felt different, more real. Toward the back of the journal, there were entries I'd always skimmed over because they didn't make sense to me. They were scattered notes about upright canids, descriptions of glowing eyes in the dark, and sketches of claw marks like the ones we'd found on the tree. One entry caught my attention. "If you hear them calling your name, don't answer. They mimic us. They want to lure you in." My heart raced as I read those words. The howls we'd been hearing, they weren't just random noises. They were something else, something intelligent. I brought the journal out to the main room where Michael, Dr. Whitefeather, and Sheriff Keller were gathered. The station felt colder than usual, even with the fire crackling in the wood stove. "I think my dad knew about whatever's out there," I said, placing the journal on the table. "Doctor." Whitefeather leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning the pages. "This is detailed," she murmured. "He must have been studying them for a long time." "He disappeared here," I said quietly, my voice shaking a little. "Right here, in Hollow Creek." Michael looked at me with a mix of concern and curiosity. "Do you think he found them?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But he was scared of them, whatever they are." Dr. Whitefeather nodded slowly. "There are stories," she began, her voice calm but heavy with meaning. "Stories about creatures that can take on human voices and appearances to trick people into following them into the woods." She paused and looked at me. "Your father might have been onto something." Later that day, while Michael and Keller were outside checking the perimeter, Dr. Whitefeather pulled me aside. "There's something I didn't tell you earlier," she said softly. "Years ago, before your father disappeared, he came to me for help." "What?" I asked, startled. She nodded solemnly. "He'd heard about my work with indigenous legends and wanted to know if there was any truth to them, especially the ones about skin changes. Did you help him?" I asked. "I tried," she said with a sigh. "But these stories are old, older than any written record, and they're not meant to be understood by outsiders." She hesitated before adding, "But your father was determined. He believed these creatures were real and that they were connected to something bigger." "Something bigger?" I echoed. Dr. Whitefeather didn't answer directly, but instead handed me a small leather pouch from her bag. "This is a protective charm," she said quietly. "It might not stop them, but it could buy you time if they come for you." I took the pouch and held it tightly in my hand, feeling its weight like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. That night, as we all sat around the table trying to figure out our next move, Garrett Wilson finally returned, or rather stumbled, into the station. His face was pale, his clothes torn and covered in dried blood. "Garrett!" Michael exclaimed as he rushed over to help him sit down. "They're real," Garrett whispered hoarsely, his eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" Keller demanded. Garrett shook his head frantically. "I saw them, 2 of them, watching me from the trees," he said in a shaky voice. "They weren't animals, but they weren't human either." "Did they attack you?" Michael asked. "No," Garrett said quickly. "They just watched me." He paused before adding in a whisper, "But one of them spoke. My blood ran cold at his words. "What did it say?" Dr. Whitefeather asked carefully. Garrett looked at me, then right at me, and said in a trembling voice, "It called your name. Vicky." The room fell silent after that, everyone exchanging uneasy glances, while my heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. "They're playing with us," Keller muttered angrily as he paced back and forth. "No," Dr. Whitefeather corrected him firmly. "They're testing us." I couldn't shake Garrett's words from my mind. It called your name. It was like my dad's warning from his journal had come alive right in front of me. "If you hear them calling your name, don't answer." I didn't know what scared me more, the fact that they knew who I was, or the possibility that they'd known all along. The wind howled outside the station that night, rattling the windows and making the whole building creak. It wasn't just the storm, it was the feeling in the air, like something was waiting, watching. Garrett had fallen asleep on the couch, his breathing shallow and uneven. Michael sat by the window, his rifle resting across his lap, while Keller paced back and forth like a caged animal. Dr. Whitefeather was at the table, flipping through her notes and muttering to herself. I sat in the corner with my dad's journal in one hand and the leather pouch she'd given me in the other. No one said it out loud, but we all knew it. Whatever was out there wasn't going to let us leave. Around midnight, the noises started again. At first, it was just faint howls in the distance, almost blending with the wind. But then they grew louder, closer, circling us. Michael stood up and peered out the window, his face tense. "They're out there," he said quietly. Keller grabbed his shotgun and moved to another window. "How many?" "I don't know," Michael replied. "But it's more than one." I joined Michael at the window, my breath fogging up the glass as I stared into the dark forest beyond. The snow reflected, just enough moonlight to make out shapes, tall shadows moving between the trees. They weren't running or charging, they were just pacing like predators sizing up their prey, and then came the voice. "Vicky." It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't a growl or a howl, it was a human voice calling my name from somewhere in the woods. "Don't answer," Dr. Whitefeather said sharply from across the room, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Whatever you do, don't answer." I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. The voice came again, louder this time. "Vicky, come outside." It sounded familiar, too familiar. My throat tightened as I realized why. It sounded like my dad's voice. "They're trying to trick you," Dr. Whitefeather said firmly as she stood and walked over to me. She placed a hand on my shoulder and held up a small bundle of sage from her bag. "Stay focused." "What do we do?" Keller asked, his grip tightening on his shotgun. "We hold our ground," Michael said calmly, though I could see the tension in his jaw. "We don't let them get inside." Dr. Whitefeather nodded and began lighting the sage with a matchstick she'd pulled from her pocket. "This won't stop them completely," she explained as she moved around the room, letting the smoke drift toward every corner, "but it might slow them down." The howls grew louder, more aggressive now, and then came another sound, scratching, at the walls of the station. It started softly but quickly grew into loud scrapes that echoed through the room, like nails on a chalkboard. "They're testing us," Dr. Whitefeather said quietly. Suddenly, there was a loud bang against one of the doors, so hard that it made all of us jump. "Barricade it!" Keller shouted as he rushed over and pushed a heavy cabinet against the door. Michael joined him, while I grabbed anything I could find to pile against it. A chair, a stack of firewood, anything to keep whatever was outside from getting in. The banging continued, each hit more forceful than the last, until it stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was silence, just long enough for us to catch our breath, and then came another sound, laughter. It wasn't human laughter, it was too deep, too guttural, but it sounded like something trying to imitate us. They're mocking us. Michael muttered under his breath. As we sat there in tense silence, Garrett suddenly woke up with a gasp and clutched his arm. "What's wrong?" I asked as I knelt beside him. He pulled up his sleeve to reveal deep scratches running down his forearm, scratches that hadn't been there before he fell asleep. "They got me," he whispered hoarsely. Dr. Whitefeather examined his arm carefully, before looking up at me with a grim expression. "This isn't good," she said quietly. "What do you mean?" I asked nervously. She hesitated before answering. "If these creatures are what I think they are, their touch can change you." "Change him? How?" Keller demanded. Dr. Whitefeather didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled out an old book from her bag and flipped through its pages until she found what she was looking for. "There are stories about people who survive encounters with these beings, but don't come back fully human," she explained carefully. Garrett's breathing grew more labored as he clutched his arm tighter. "We need to act fast," Dr. Whitefeather said firmly as she began preparing some kind of ritual with herbs and symbols drawn on paper. The banging on the door started again, harder this time, and now it wasn't just one door. It was all around us, windows rattling, walls shaking, voices calling out our names from every direction. I clutched my dad's journal tightly as fear threatened to overwhelm me. But then I remembered his words. "They want you scared." Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to focus on what mattered, protecting everyone inside and finding out what happened to my dad, even if it meant facing whatever was out there head on. The banging on the doors and windows didn't stop. It was relentless, like whatever was out there had all the time in the world to wear us down. The voices calling our names grew louder, more insistent, and more twisted with each passing minute. "Vicky, let me in!" I gripped the leather pouch Dr. Whitefeather had given me so tightly my knuckles turned white. My dad's voice, or what sounded like it, kept echoing in my head. I knew it wasn't real, but it was hard not to feel the pull of it, hard not to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he really was out there. "We can't stay like this all night," Michael said, his voice steady but strained. He stood by the barricaded door, his rifle at the ready. "We need a plan." Dr. Whitefeather nodded, her face calm but serious. "These creatures are testing us," she said. "They want to see how far they can push us before we break." "Well, they're doing a damn good job," Keller muttered as he paced near the window, his shotgun clutched tightly in his hands. "What do they want?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. Dr. Whitefeather looked at me with a grim expression. "They feed on fear," she said simply. "The more scared we are, the stronger they get." Michael stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "Then we fight back," he said firmly. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to break through." "How?" Keller asked skeptically. "You saw what they did to Garrett, and that was without even getting inside." "We use what we have," Michael replied, gesturing toward the supplies around the room. Tools, weapons, anything that could be turned into a defense. "And we use what Dr. Whitefeather knows about them." Dr. Whitefeather nodded slowly. "There are ways to weaken them," she said. "They don't like fire or certain herbs. Sage, cedar, juniper, and silver. Silver can hurt them." "Silver?" I asked, my mind racing as I remembered something from my dad's journal. He'd written about carrying silver bullets during his patrols in Hollow Creek, just in case. I ran to my room and dug through my bag until I found the small metal box where I kept some of his old belongings. Inside were a few tarnished silver coins and a single silver knife with a worn leather handle. My hands shook as I brought them back to the main room. "This is all I have," I said, placing them on the table. Dr. Whitefeather picked up the knife and examined it carefully. "This will work," she said with a nod. We spent the next hour preparing as best we could. Dr. Whitefeather burned sage and cedar around the room, while Michael and Keller reinforced the barricades and set up makeshift weapons, sharp tools, heavy objects to throw, anything that might slow the creatures down if they got inside. Garrett was still lying on the couch, his condition worsening by the minute. His skin was pale and clammy, and he kept mumbling incoherently under his breath. "What's happening to him?" I asked quietly as Dr. Whitefeather checked his pulse. "He's changing," she said softly, her voice heavy with sorrow. "Changing? Into what?" Keller demanded. She looked up at him with tired eyes. "Into one of them." A cold chill ran down my spine at her words. "Is there anything we can do for him?" I asked desperately. Dr. Whitefeather hesitated before answering. "If we can stop them before sunrise, maybe." As midnight crept closer, the creatures outside grew bolder. The banging turned into scratching that sounded like claws raking against wood and glass. Their voices became more distorted, less human, like they were losing patience. And then the silence. The sudden quiet was almost worse than the noise had been. "What are they doing?" Keller whispered, peering out through a crack in one of the boarded-up windows. "They're waiting," Dr. Whitefeather said calmly as she placed a protective charm near Garrett's head. "For what?" Michael asked. "For us to make a mistake." It didn't take long for their next move to come. The power went out suddenly, plunging us into darkness, except for the faint glow of the fire in the wood stove. "Flashlights!" Michael barked as we scrambled to grab whatever light sources we could find. But before anyone could react further, there was a loud crash from one of the windows near the back of the station, and then another from the front door. "They're coming in!" Keller shouted as he raised his shotgun. Michael fired his rifle at one of the broken windows, while Keller aimed at the door. But it wasn't enough to stop them completely. Through the flickering beams of our flashlights, I caught glimpses of, in them, tall figures with glowing eyes and twisted shapes that didn't look fully solid, like shadows given form. One of them lunged toward me, its claws swiping through the air inches from my face. But before it could reach me, Michael tackled it with everything he had. "Get back!" he shouted as he wrestled with the creature. I grabbed the silver knife from where it lay on the table and plunged it into its side without thinking. And for a moment, everything stopped. The creature let out an unearthly screech before dissolving into black smoke that disappeared into thin air. "It works!" Dr. Whitefeather shouted over the chaos as she threw burning sage toward another creature trying to climb through a window. But even as we fought back with everything we had, more of them kept coming, and deep down I knew this wasn't over yet. The station was chaos. The creatures were relentless, clawing at the windows and doors, their glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. Their voices, distorted and unnatural, echoed inside my head, calling my name over and over. "Vicky, come outside, we're waiting for you." Michael was shouting orders, his rifle firing at anything that moved. Keller was swinging his shotgun like a madman, yelling curses as he tried to keep them from breaking through. Dr. Whitefeather was chanting something under her breath, her hands trembling as she burned more sage and cedar, and Garrett was slipping away. He was lying on the couch, his breathing shallow, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes flickered open for a moment, and he looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Fear, anger, desperation. "Help me," he whispered weakly, his voice barely audible over the chaos around us. I wanted to help him, I really did, but I didn't know how. Dr. Whitefeather had said there was a chance to save him if we stopped the creatures before sunrise. But sunrise felt like a lifetime away. One of the creatures broke through the barricade on the front door, its twisted form towering over us as it lunged forward with claws extended. Keller fired his shotgun point-blank into its chest, but it barely flinched before swiping at him and knocking him to the ground. Michael tackled it again, just like he had before, but this time it was stronger, more aggressive, and he struggled. "To hold it back! Vicky!" he shouted as he fought to keep its claws away from his face. The knife! I grabbed the silver knife from the table and ran toward them, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. With all the strength I could muster, I stabbed the creature in its side again, and just like before, it let out an ear-piercing screech before dissolving into black smoke. Michael fell back onto the floor, gasping for breath as he looked up at me with wide eyes. "You saved me," he said quietly, his voice filled with disbelief and gratitude. I didn't have time to respond because another creature was already clawing its way through one of the windows near Garrett's couch. Dr. Whitefeather stepped forward then, her face calm but determined, as she held up a bundle of burning herbs in one hand and a small pouch in the other. "I can stop them," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "But it will cost me." "What do you mean?" I asked desperately. She looked at me with tired eyes, the kind of eyes that had seen too much but still held on to hope. "These creatures are tied to this land," she explained quickly. "They're ancient spirits, twisted by fear and anger, and they won't leave unless someone breaks their connection." "How do we do that?" Michael asked, as he struggled to get back on his feet. Dr. Whitefeather hesitated for a moment before answering. "A sacrifice." "No," I said immediately, shaking my head in disbelief. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," she said softly but firmly. Before anyone could stop her, Dr. Whitefeather walked toward the center of the room where most of the creatures were gathering, circling us like predators waiting for their prey to weaken. She began, chanting louder now, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The creatures hesitated for a moment, as if they understood what she was doing, and then lunged toward her all at once. "Stop!" I screamed as I ran toward her with the silver knife in hand, but Michael grabbed me and held me back. "She knows what she's doing," he said quietly, his voice trembling. Dr. Whitefeather turned to look at me one last time before finishing her chant. "Protect them," she said simply, and then everything exploded into light. The creatures let out deafening screams as they dissolved into smoke one by one until there was nothing left but silence. Dr. Whitefeather collapsed onto the floor, her body lifeless but peaceful, as if she'd finally found rest after years of fighting against forces too powerful to understand. I knelt beside her, tears streaming down my face as I whispered, "Thank you." The station was quiet now, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, but also safe. Garrett's breathing had stabilized slightly. He wasn't fully healed yet, but seemed less pale than before, and Michael helped Keller back onto his feet while we all tried to process what had just happened. "She saved us," Keller muttered under his breath as he looked around at the empty room where shadows had once loomed so large. "Yes," Michael agreed quietly, but none of us could shake the feeling that this wasn't over yet. The station was eerily quiet after Dr. Whitefeather's sacrifice. The creatures were gone, but the air still felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. None of us spoke for a long time. We just sat there, trying to make sense of what had happened. Garrett was still lying on the couch, his breathing shallow but steady. Michael and Keller were patching up the barricades, though we all knew the worst of it was over, for now. I sat at the table, staring at my dad's journal, flipping through the pages like it might suddenly give me all the answers I needed. And then I found it, a map. It was a rough sketch of Hollow Creek, with trails and landmarks marked in my dad's handwriting. One spot caught my eye, an old mining office deep in the woods. Next to it he'd written a single word: nest. My stomach tightened as I stared at the map. My dad had been investigating these creatures before he disappeared. If he'd marked this place as their nest, then maybe, just maybe, I could find out what happened to him there. "We need to go," I said suddenly, breaking the silence. Michael looked up from where he was hammering a board into place. "Go where?" I held up the map. "My dad marked this spot as their nest. If we want to end this for good, we need to find it." Keller frowned. "Are you crazy? We barely survived tonight, and now you want to go looking for them?" "They're weak right now," I argued. Dr. Whitefeather's ritual drove them off, but if we don't do something, they'll come back, and next time we might not be so lucky. Michael studied the map for a moment, before nodding slowly. "She's right," he said quietly. "If we don't stop them now, they'll just keep coming." Keller sighed heavily, but didn't argue further. "Fine," he muttered. "But if this goes south, don't say I didn't warn you." We left Garrett behind at the station with enough supplies to last until sunrise and set out into the woods with flashlights and whatever weapons we could carry. Michael with his rifle, Keller with his shotgun, and me with my dad's silver knife tucked into my belt. The snow crunched under our boots as we followed the map deeper into the forest. The trees loomed tall and silent around us, their branches heavy with snow that glittered faintly in the moonlight. No one spoke much as we walked. The tension between us was thick enough to cut with a knife. After about an hour of hiking, we reached the entrance to an old mining tunnel carved into the side of a rocky hill. The wooden beams supporting the entrance were rotted and splintered, and a faint smell of damp earth and decay wafted out from inside. "This is it," I said quietly, holding up the map. "Great," Keller muttered under his breath. "A creepy, oh mine, just what I wanted." Michael shone his flashlight into the tunnel's darkness before stepping forward cautiously. "Stay close," he said over his shoulder. We moved slowly through the tunnel, our flashlights casting long shadows on the walls around us. The air grew colder and heavier with every step we took, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. About halfway through the tunnel, we found something that made my blood run cold. Claw marks on the walls, deep gouges that ran along both sides of the passage, like something huge had dragged its claws through solid rock. "This is their territory," Michael said grimly. "Yeah," Keller muttered nervously, "and we're walking right into it." We pressed on, despite our fear, until we reached a large chamber at the end of the tunnel, a cavernous space lit faintly by cracks in the ceiling where moonlight filtered through. In the center of the chamber was a pile of bones, animal bones, mixed with human ones, and scattered among them were scraps of clothing and personal items, watches, wallets, things that belonged to people who had disappeared in Hollow Creek over the years. My heart sank as I spotted something familiar among the debris, a worn leather notebook, the same kind my dad used for his journals. I rushed forward and picked it up with trembling hands. "It's his," I whispered hoarsely. Michael and Keller stood behind me silently as I flipped through its pages. Most of them were blank or smeared with dirt and blood, but one entry near the back caught my eye. "They can be killed, but only if you destroy their alpha." "What does it mean?" Michael asked quietly. I swallowed hard before answering. "These creatures, they're like a pack. If we take out their leader, maybe it'll stop them for good." Before anyone could respond, a low growl echoed through the chamber, a sound so deep and guttural that it made my chest vibrate. We turned toward the source of the noise just in time to see something step out from one of the shadows. A creature taller than any of us had imagined, its glowing eyes fixed on us like burning coals. It wasn't just big, it was wrong. Its body shifted unnaturally as it moved closer, its limbs too long and its movements too smooth for anything that should exist in real life. "That's got to be their alpha," Keller muttered shakily as he raised his shotgun. The creature let out another growl before lunging toward us, and all hell broke loose. The alpha creature lunged at us, its claws slicing through the air like knives. Keller fired his shotgun, the blast echoing through the cavern, but it barely slowed the thing down. It roared, a sound so loud and unnatural that it felt like it was shaking the ground beneath us. "Move!" Michael shouted, pulling me back. As the creature swiped at where I'd just been standing, I clutched the silver knife tightly in my hand, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto me, and for a moment I felt frozen in place. It wasn't just looking at me, it was inside my head, twisting my thoughts, making me doubt everything. Vicky. It spoke my name in that distorted voice again, and this time it sounded almost pleading. You don't have to fight. I shook my head violently, trying to block out its words. You're lying, I shouted back. Michael fired his rifle, hitting the creature square in the chest. It staggered for a moment before letting out another deafening roar and charging at him. Keller grabbed a metal pipe from the ground and swung it at the creature's head with all his strength, knocking it off balance just long enough for Michael to reload. We need to kill it now, Michael yelled as he aimed again. I remembered my dad's journal, the entry about destroying the Alpha, and knew what I had to do. The silver knife was our only chance. Cover me! I shouted as I ran toward the creature, dodging its claws and teeth as best I could. Michael and Keller fired their weapons repeatedly, distracting it just enough for me to get close. My hands were shaking as I raised the knife, but I forced myself to focus on what mattered, ending this nightmare once and for all. The creature turned toward me at the last second, its glowing eyes narrowing as it realized what I was about to do. It lunged forward, its claws inches from my face, but I plunged the knife into its chest with all my strength before it could reach me. For a moment, everything stopped. The creature let out a horrible screech that echoed through the cavern before, collapsing onto the ground in a heap of black smoke and twisted limbs. Its body dissolved slowly into ash, leaving nothing behind but silence. Michael and Keller rushed over to me as I fell to my knees, gasping for breath. You did it, Michael said quietly, his voice filled with relief. I nodded weakly, still, clutching the knife in my trembling hand. As we made our way back through the tunnel, the air felt lighter, less oppressive, and the forest outside seemed calmer than before. The howls were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that somehow felt peaceful. When we returned to the station, Garrett was sitting up on the couch, his color returning slowly but noticeably. They're gone, he said softly when he saw us. They won't be coming back, I replied firmly. The next morning, as sunlight finally broke through the clouds and melted some of the snow outside, we packed up our things and prepared to leave Hollow Creek behind. Before we left, I buried Dr. Whitefeather's protective charm near her favorite spot by the station, a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, and whispered a quiet thank you for everything she'd done to save us. As we drove away from Hollow Creek, in Sheriff Keller's truck later that day, I couldn't help but look back at the forest one last time. I didn't find all the answers I'd been looking for, not about my dad or why these creatures existed, but I found enough to know that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and maybe that's okay. My name is Thomas Martinez, and I've been a forest ranger for over 15 years. I've seen all kinds of things out here in the wilderness, lost hikers, wildfires, animal attacks, but nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened last fall in Sequoia National Forest. I used to think I knew these woods like the back of my hand. Every trail, every tree, every sound, it all felt familiar like an old friend. But that's the thing about the forest. It has a way of hiding its secrets until it's too late. It all started on a crisp October morning, the kind of day where the air smells like pine and the leaves crunch under your boots. I was sitting in my cabin at the ranger station, sipping on my third cup of coffee and trying to ignore the stack of paperwork on my desk. My radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. Martinez, we've got another one, came the voice of Officer Jack Thompson, my contact with local law enforcement. His tone was serious, which wasn't unusual for him, but there was something else this time, something heavier. Another what? I asked, already knowing I wouldn't like the answer. Missing hiker. Young couple this time. They were supposed to check out 2 days ago, but never did. Their car's still in the lot. I sighed and rubbed my temples. This wasn't the first time someone had gone missing in these woods, but lately it had been Happening more often than usual, too often. All right, I said, I'll head out and take a look. Before I left, I grabbed my gear, a flashlight, a map, my radio, and my old hunting knife. It wasn't much, but it made me feel better to have it on me. You never know what you might run into out there. As I stepped outside, I took a deep breath of the cool mountain air. The sun was just starting to rise over the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. It was beautiful in a way that made you forget how dangerous this place could be. I made my way to the trailhead where the couple's car was parked. It was an older model sedan with a layer of dust on it that told me it hadn't moved in days. Inside were some empty water bottles and a map folded neatly on the passenger seat, a map that showed they'd been planning to hike up to Eagle's Peak. Eagle's Peak wasn't an easy hike. It was steep, rocky and remote, exactly the kind of place where people could get into trouble if they weren't careful. As I started up the trail, I couldn't shake this feeling that something was off. The forest felt different somehow, quieter than usual. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just silence. It was like the whole place was holding its breath. About an hour into my hike, I came across something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A deer carcass lying just off the trail. Its body was torn open in a way that didn't look natural, like something had ripped it apart with claws instead of teeth. I crouched down to get a closer look and noticed strange marks around its neck and sides, long gashes that didn't match any predator I knew of in these woods. Mountain lions don't do this kind of damage, and bears usually leave more behind than just clean cuts like these. That's when I heard it, the sound that would haunt me for weeks afterward. It started as a low growl coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. At first, I thought maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, or maybe even an echo from some distant animal call. But then it grew louder and closer. My heart started pounding as I stood up and scanned my surroundings with my flashlight. The beam cut through the shadows but didn't reveal anything except more trees and rocks. "Hello?" I called out, even though I knew better than to expect an answer. The growling stopped abruptly, as if whatever had made it knew I was looking for it and didn't want to be found. I stood there for what felt like an eternity before finally deciding to move on. Whatever had killed that deer wasn't something I wanted to meet face to face, not without backup anyway. By midday, I reached a small clearing where someone had set up camp recently. A tent half collapsed on one side with gear scattered around, like whoever had been here left in a hurry. There were no signs of struggle, no blood or footprints, but something about this place felt wrong too, like whoever had been here wasn't alone when they left. Radioed back to Jack to let him know what I'd found so far. "No sign of them yet," I said quietly into my mic, as if speaking too loudly might wake up whatever was lurking nearby. "Keep looking," he replied curtly before signing off again, without another word. And so I kept going deeper into those woods, deeper into whatever nightmare waited for me there. After finding that abandoned campsite and the torn-up deer, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I made my way back to the ranger station, hoping to regroup and figure out my next move. The forest felt heavier now, like it was pressing in on me with every step. Even the sunlight filtering through the trees seemed dimmer somehow. When I got back to the station, Officer Jack Thompson was waiting for me. Jack was a tall guy with a no-nonsense attitude. He'd seen his fair share of strange things over the years, but even he looked uneasy this time. "Find anything?" he asked, leaning against his squad car. I nodded. "Abandoned campsite up near Eagle's Peak. No sign of the hikers, but there's something weird going on out there." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Weird how?" I hesitated for a moment before answering. "There's a dead deer on the trail. Looks like it was attacked by something. Not a bear or mountain lion, though. The cuts are different." Jack frowned and crossed his arms. "Different how?" I shook my head. "I don't know how to explain it. Just doesn't look natural." "Jack, Didn't say anything for a while, just stared off into the woods like he was trying to figure out what to do next. Finally, he spoke. "All right, we'll need to go back out there, check the area again, maybe widen the search." I sighed and rubbed my temples. I wasn't looking forward to going back into those woods, but I knew we didn't have much of a choice. Before we headed out, Jack called in some backup, a couple of volunteers from search and rescue, and another ranger named Jeremy Wilson. Jeremy was younger than me, fresh out of training and full of enthusiasm for his job. He was one of those guys who loved talking about local legends and folklore, always eager to share some creepy story about ghosts or monsters in the woods. As we loaded up our gear and prepared to head back out, Jeremy couldn't help but bring up one of his favorite topics, skinwalkers. "You ever hear about them?" he asked as we walked toward the trailhead. I glanced at him, already regretting letting him tag along. "Skinwalkers? Yeah, I've heard stories." Jeremy grinned like a kid telling a spooky campfire tale. "They're supposed to be these shape-shifting creatures from Native American legends, can take on the form of animals or even people. Pretty creepy stuff." Jack rolled his eyes but didn't say anything. Diane Powell, one of the search and rescue volunteers, looked uncomfortable as she adjusted her backpack. "Let's focus on finding those hikers," Jack said firmly, cutting Jeremy off before he could launch into another story. The hike back up to Eagle's Peak felt different this time, not just because there were more of us, but because the forest seemed even quieter than before. No birds chirping, no wind rustling through the trees, just that eerie silence that made you feel like you were being watched. As we reached the abandoned campsite again, Diane pointed out something I hadn't noticed earlier. Strange markings carved into one of the trees near the tent. They looked like symbols, circles and lines arranged in a pattern that didn't make any sense to me. "What do you think they mean?" she asked quietly. Jeremy stepped closer to get a better look. "Could be some kind of ritual," he said, with way too much excitement in his voice. Jack shot him a warning look, but didn't say anything. We spent hours searching the area around Eagle's Peak, calling out for the missing hikers, checking every trail and clearing, but found nothing except more signs that someone had been there recently. Footprints in the dirt, empty water bottles left behind. By late afternoon, we decided to split up into pairs to cover more ground. Jack, with Diane, and me with Jeremy. As Jeremy and I made our way deeper into the woods, he couldn't resist bringing up skinwalkers again. "You know," he said casually as we climbed over a fallen tree trunk, "some people think they're responsible for disappearances like this." I sighed and kept walking. "Jeremy, let's not jump to conclusions." He shrugged but didn't seem fazed by my dismissal. "I'm just saying, it's weird how many people go missing in places like this without any trace." I didn't respond. I couldn't argue with him because deep down, I was starting to wonder if there might be some truth to those stories after all. As we continued searching, that uneasy feeling grew stronger, the sense that something was watching us from just beyond the trees. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between trunks or branches, swaying when there wasn't any wind. But whenever I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. "Thomas," Jeremy said suddenly, his voice low and tense. I stopped walking and turned to face him. "What is it?" He pointed ahead toward a clearing where something shiny caught the light, a piece of metal lying half buried in the dirt. We stepped closer to investigate and found what looked like part of a hiking backpack, a buckle or strap that had been torn clean off, as if someone had ripped it apart with their bare hands. Jeremy swallowed hard as he picked it up and examined it more closely. This doesn't look right." He was right. It didn't look right at all. Jeremy and I stared at the torn strap in silence for a long moment. It was clear that something bad had happened here, but the question was, what? And where were the hikers? "We should call Jack," Jeremy said finally, his voice quieter than usual. I nodded and pulled out my radio. Jack, we found something, a piece of gear from one of the hikers. Looks like it's been damaged. There was a pause before Jack responded. Where are you? About half a mile east of the campsite, I said. Near a clearing. All right, Jack replied. Stay put. Diane and I are heading your way. Jeremy and I sat down on a nearby log to wait for them. The forest around us felt heavier than ever, like the trees were closing in on us. I kept scanning the area, my flashlight cutting through the shadows, but all I saw were more trees and rocks. You think it's an animal? Jeremy asked after a while. I shrugged. Could be, but if it is, it's not acting like any animal I've seen before. Jeremy didn't say anything after that, just stared at the torn strap in his hands, like he was trying to figure out how it ended up here. When Jack and Diane arrived, we showed them what we'd found. Jack frowned as he turned the strap over. In his hands, this doesn't look like normal wear and tear, he said finally. No, I agreed. It looks like it was ripped apart. Diane glanced around nervously. Do you think they're still alive? Jack didn't answer right away, which told me he wasn't sure either. We'll keep looking, he said finally. But we need to be careful. If there's an animal out here, it might still be close. We decided to stick together this time as we continued searching the area around the clearing. The sun was starting to set now, casting long shadows across the ground and turning the sky a deep orange. It would be dark soon, and none of us wanted to be out here after nightfall. As we moved deeper into the woods, we started finding more signs that someone had been here recently. Broken branches, footprints in the dirt, but no sign of the hikers themselves. Then we came across something that made my stomach drop. Another campsite, this one even more torn up than the first. The tent was shredded, its poles snapped in half like twigs. Gear was scattered everywhere, clothes, food wrappers, a flashlight with its lens cracked. Jack crouched down to examine the ground around the tent, while Diane picked up one of the torn pieces of fabric. This isn't normal, she said quietly. No, Jack agreed. It's not. Jeremy stepped closer to one of the trees near the campsite and froze. Guys? We turned to see what he was looking at and saw more of those strange markings carved into the bark, circles and lines arranged in patterns. That didn't make any sense. What are these? Diane asked nervously. Could be some kind of ritual, Jeremy said again, his voice shaking slightly this time. Jack shook his head. Ritual or not, it doesn't explain what happened here. As we stood there trying to make sense of it all, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a faint whispering sound coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. Did you hear that? I asked quietly. The others nodded, their faces pale. What is it? Diane whispered. I don't know, Jack said grimly, but we need to get out of here before it gets dark. We started making our way back toward the trailhead as quickly as we could without running. The whispering grew louder as we moved, low and guttural at first, but gradually rising into something almost human-like, but not quite. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between trees or branches swaying when there wasn't any wind. But whenever I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. By the time we reached the trailhead, again, it was full-on dark outside. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over everything. We'll regroup at the station, Jack said firmly as we loaded our gear into his squad car. Figure out our next steps from there. As we drove back to the station in silence, I couldn't shake this feeling that whatever had happened out there wasn't over yet, that whatever was lurking in those woods wasn't done with us. Back at the ranger station, the atmosphere was heavy, the kind of silence that makes you feel like something's about to happen. Jack paced back and forth near the radio, his jaw clenched tight. Diane sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she hadn't touched. Jeremy was fidgeting with his flashlight, clicking it on and off like he couldn't sit still. I stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. The forest looked different at night, more alive somehow, but not in a good way. It felt like it was watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. "We need to go back out there," Jack said finally, breaking the silence. "Tonight?" Diane asked, her voice shaky. Jack nodded. "Whatever's out there isn't going away. If we wait until morning, we might lose any chance of finding those hikers." Jeremy looked up from his flashlight. "You think they're still alive?" Jack didn't answer right away. "I don't know," he said finally, "but we have to try." I sighed and rubbed my temples. I didn't want to go back out there, not after everything we'd seen. But Jack was right. If there was even a chance those hikers were still alive, we had to find them. We grabbed our gear and headed back out into the woods. The trail looked completely different in the dark. The trees casting long shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. The air felt colder now, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been. The crunch of leaves under our boots, the rustle of branches in the wind. As we made our way deeper into the forest, I started noticing things I hadn't seen before. Landmarks that seemed out of place, or trails that didn't match the map. It was like the forest itself was changing, shifting around us. "Is it just me?" Jeremy whispered. "Or does this place look different?" "It's not just you," I said quietly. We came across another clearing, a wide open space surrounded by tall trees that seemed to lean inward like they were trying to keep us out. In the center of the clearing was something I couldn't explain, a circle of stones arranged in a pattern that looked ancient, like it had been there for centuries. "What is this?" Diane asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jeremy crouched down to get a closer look at the stones. "Looks like some kind of ritual site," he said, his tone more serious than usual. Jack frowned as he scanned the area with his flashlight. "Ritual or not, it doesn't explain what happened to those hikers." As we stood there trying to make sense of it all, I heard something that made my stomach drop, a low growling sound coming from somewhere nearby. "Did you hear that?" Diane whispered. We all nodded silently, our eyes darting around the clearing as we tried to figure out where the sound was coming from. The growling grew louder, more guttural, until it sounded like it was right on top of us. But when we turned to look, there was nothing there. "Let's move," Jack said firmly, his voice steady despite the fear I could see in his eyes. We started making our way back toward the trailhead again, but something about the forest felt different now, like it was alive in a way it hadn't been before. The trees seemed taller somehow, their branches reaching out toward us as if they were trying to grab us. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement in the shadows, a flash of something pale darting between trunks, or a pair of glowing eyes, staring back at me, but whenever I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. By the time we reached another clearing, we were all on edge, jumping at every sound and scanning our surroundings constantly. That's when we saw it, another set of markings carved into one of the trees near the edge of the clearing. These markings were different from the ones we'd seen before, more intricate somehow, with symbols that seemed almost human-like. "What do you think they mean?" Diane asked nervously. Jeremy stepped closer to get a better look, but stopped suddenly as if he'd seen something that froze him in place. "What is it?" Jack asked sharply. Jeremy pointed toward one of the symbols, a crude drawing of what looked like a face with hollow eyes and jagged teeth. It's watching us," Jeremy whispered. Before any of us could respond, we heard something that made my blood run cold, a loud snapping sound coming from somewhere behind us, like someone or something had just stepped on a branch. We turned around slowly, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, and saw nothing but trees and shadows. "Let's go," Jack said firmly, his voice steady despite how pale he looked. We started moving again, faster this time, but still careful not to make too much noise. The growling had stopped now, replaced by an eerie silence that felt even worse somehow, like whatever had been following us was waiting for its moment to strike. By the time we reached another trailhead leading back toward the ranger station, none of us wanted to talk about what had just happened, not yet anyway. We needed time to process it all, to figure out what was real and what wasn't. But deep down I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was lurking in those woods wasn't done with us yet. And this nightmare was far from over. Back at the ranger station, none of us said much. The silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, like we were all trying to make sense of what had just happened. Jeremy sat in the corner, his head in his hands. Diane paced back and forth near the door, her eyes darting to the window every few seconds. Jack was at the radio again, trying to reach someone higher up for help. I stood by the table, staring at the crude drawing Jeremy had sketched on a piece of paper, the face we'd seen carved into the tree. Hollow eyes, jagged teeth. It didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before, but it felt familiar somehow, like I'd seen it in a nightmare. Jack slammed the radio down on the table, making us all jump. No response, he muttered angrily. Signal's too weak. What do we do now? Diane asked, her voice shaky. Jack sighed and rubbed his temples. We wait until morning. It's too dangerous to go back out there tonight. Jeremy looked up from his seat, his face pale. You think it's safe here? Jack didn't answer right away, which told me he wasn't sure. It's safer than out there, he said finally. We tried to settle in for the night, but none of us could relax. Every sound outside made us jump. The creak of a branch in the wind, the rustle of leaves against the window. The forest felt alive now, like it was watching us even here at the station. Around midnight, I decided to step outside for some fresh air. The cabin felt suffocating, and I needed a moment to clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch, letting the cool night air wash over me. The forest was eerily quiet. No wind, no animals, just silence. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. Was about to head back inside when I heard it, a faint whispering sound coming from somewhere nearby. It was low at first, almost like it was carried on the wind, but then it grew louder, closer. Hello? I called out instinctively, even though I knew better than to expect an answer. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a low growl that made my stomach drop. I turned my flashlight toward the sound and froze. Standing just beyond the edge of the clearing was something I couldn't explain, something that shouldn't exist. At first glance, it looked like a man, tall and thin, but its movements were wrong somehow, jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Its face was pale and hollow-eyed, just like the carving on the tree. A face that didn't belong to anything human. My heart pounded as I backed toward the door slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. The creature tilted its head as if it were studying me, its jagged mouth curling into a twisted grin. I fumbled with the door handle behind me, but couldn't take my eyes off it, not even for a second. It felt like if I looked away, it would move closer. Finally, my hand found the handle and yanked it open. I stumbled inside and slammed the door shut behind me. What happened? Jack asked sharply as he jumped up from his seat. There's something out there, I stammered, my voice shaking. Jack grabbed his flashlight and headed for the door without hesitation. Diane tried to stop him. Jack, don't go out there. But Jack ignored her and stepped outside, with Jeremy close behind him. I followed reluctantly, my heart racing as we scanned the clearing with our flashlights. It was gone, whatever had been. There wasn't any more, but there were footprints in the dirt where it had stood, long and thin with claw-like toes that didn't match any animal I'd ever seen before. What is this? Jeremy whispered as he crouched down to examine them. Jack didn't answer right away, but kept scanning the area with his flashlight like he expected it to reappear any second. We're not alone out here, he said finally, his voice grim. We headed back inside quickly after that and locked every door and window we could find. None of us slept that night, not really anyway. But by morning we knew one thing for sure. Whatever was lurking in those woods wasn't just some animal or legend. It was real, and it wasn't done with us yet. The morning light didn't bring much comfort. The forest still felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to step back into its shadows. None of us had slept more than a few minutes the night before, but we knew we couldn't stay at the ranger station forever. If those hikers were still out there, they were running out of time. Jack gathered us around the table to plan our next move. He spread out a map of the forest and pointed to the areas we hadn't searched yet. "We'll split into 2 teams," he said firmly. "Diane and I will head north toward the river. Thomas and Jeremy, you take the trail leading west toward Eagle's Peak." I didn't like the idea of splitting up, not after everything we'd seen, but Jack was right. We'd cover more ground that way. "Stay in contact," Jack added, tapping his radio for emphasis. "If you see anything, you call it in immediately." We nodded and grabbed our gear. My hands felt shaky as I packed my flashlight, knife, and extra batteries into my backpack. Jeremy was unusually quiet as he checked his equipment, his usual enthusiasm replaced by a nervous energy that made me worry about him. As we stepped outside, the forest greeted us with its eerie silence again. The sunlight filtering through the trees felt weak somehow, like it couldn't quite reach the ground. Jeremy and I headed west along the trail, our footsteps crunching softly against the dirt. Every now and then, I thought I heard something behind us, a faint rustling sound or a twig snapping, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. "You think it's still watching us?" Jeremy asked quietly. I didn't answer right away because I wasn't sure what to say. Finally, I nodded. "Probably." Jeremy swallowed hard and tightened his grip on his flashlight. "What do you think it wants?" I shook my head. "I don't." And no. We walked in silence for a while after that, both of us scanning the trees constantly for any sign of movement. The deeper we went into the forest, the more strange things we started to notice. Landmarks that seemed out of place or trails that didn't match the map. At one point, we came across a pile of rocks arranged in another strange pattern. Circles within circles that looked almost deliberate. "What is this?" Jeremy asked as he crouched down to examine it. I shook my head again. "I don't know." As we stood, there trying to make sense of it all, I heard something that made my stomach drop, a faint whispering sound coming from somewhere nearby. "Do you hear that?" Jeremy whispered. I nodded and turned toward the sound, my flashlight cutting through the shadows. The whispering grew louder as we moved closer, low and guttural at first, but gradually rising into something almost human-like, but not quite. Then we saw it, the creature from last night standing just beyond the edge of another clearing. It looked like a man again, tall and thin, but its movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural like before, its hollow eyes locked onto us as it tilted, its head slowly, its jagged mouth curling into that same twisted grin. "Run," I said quietly but firmly. Jeremy didn't need to be told twice. We turned and bolted back toward the trail as fast as we could, our flashlights bouncing wildly with every step. The creature didn't chase us, not right away anyway, but I could feel it watching us as we ran. Every now and then, I thought, I heard its footsteps behind us, soft but deliberate, like it was stalking us instead of chasing outright. When we finally stopped to catch our breath near a fallen tree trunk, Jeremy looked at me with wide eyes. "What is that thing?" "I don't know," I said honestly, my voice shaking slightly. "We can't keep running," he said after a moment. "If it wants us dead, it'll find us eventually." He was right, but that didn't make me feel any better about what we had to do next. "We'll set a trap," I said finally. "Use what we have to lure it in, and take it down." Jeremy nodded reluctantly but didn't argue. We spent the next hour gathering supplies from our backpacks and nearby areas, rope, branches, anything we could use to create some kind of makeshift trap. As we worked, that uneasy feeling grew stronger, the sense that something was watching us from just beyond the trees. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between trunks or branches, swaying when there wasn't any wind. But whenever I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. By the time we finished setting up our trap near another clearing, night had fallen again, and with it came that eerie silence once more. We waited in tense silence for what felt like hours, but deep down, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was lurking in those woods wasn't done with us yet, and this nightmare was far from over. The trap was ready. Jeremy and I sat in the shadows near the clearing, our backs pressed against a large tree. We had tied ropes to branches above us, rigged to fall and pin anything that stepped into the center of the clearing. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best we could do with what we had. The forest around us was quiet, too quiet. That heavy silence had returned, wrapping around us like a blanket we couldn't shake off. Every sound, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart jump. Jeremy was gripping his flashlight tightly, his knuckles white. "What if it doesn't come?" he whispered. "It'll come," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. We waited for what felt like hours, our nerves stretched thin. The moonlight barely reached us through the thick canopy of trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. My flashlight was off. I didn't want to give away our position, but I kept my hand on it, ready to switch it on at a moment's notice. Then we heard it, a faint, rustling sound coming from somewhere nearby. It was soft at first, almost like the wind moving through the trees, but then it grew louder, closer. Jeremy tensed beside me. "Is that?" I nodded silently and motioned for him to stay quiet. The rustling stopped suddenly, replaced by a low, growling sound that made my stomach drop. It was the same growl we'd heard before, deep and guttural, like something that didn't belong in this world. I tightened my grip on my flashlight as I scanned the clearing with my eyes, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. Then I saw it. A shadow moving between the trees on the far side of the clearing. It was tall and thin again, its movements jerky and unnatural like before. It stepped into the moonlight slowly, its hollow eyes locking onto us, as if it knew exactly where we were hiding. Jeremy let out a shaky breath beside me. "Thomas, stay calm," I whispered. "Don't move." The creature tilted its head again, its jagged mouth curling into that twisted grin that made my skin crawl. It stepped closer to the center of the clearing, closer to our trap, and for a moment I thought we might actually have a chance. But then something happened that made my blood run cold. A voice called out from behind us. "Thomas! Jeremy!" I turned sharply toward the sound and saw Jack stepping into view from the trail behind us. Diane was with him, her flashlight cutting through the darkness as they approached. "What are you doing here?" I hissed angrily. "You were supposed to be heading north." Jack frowned as he looked at me. "We lost radio contact and came back to find you." Before I could respond, Diane pointed toward the clearing. "What is that?" Jack turned his flashlight toward the creature, and everything went wrong. The creature let out an ear-piercing screech that echoed through the forest like nails on a chalkboard. It moved faster than anything I'd ever seen before, darting toward Jack and Diane like a blur of shadows and pale skin. "Run!" I shouted as I grabbed Jeremy's arm and pulled him toward the trail. Jack and Diane turned to flee as well, their flashlights bouncing wildly with every step. But something about Jack's movements caught my attention. He wasn't running right. His steps were too smooth, too deliberate. Then it hit me. The creature wasn't chasing them anymore because it didn't need to. Jack stopped suddenly and turned toward us with that same twisted grin on his face. A grin that didn't belong to anything human. "Jack?" Diane asked hesitantly as she stopped beside him. Jack tilted his head slowly before lunging at her without warning. She screamed as he grabbed her arm and threw her to the ground with unnatural strength. "Run!" I shouted again as Jeremy and I bolted down the trail without looking back. The forest seemed alive now, branches reaching out toward us like hands trying to grab us as we ran. The growling followed close behind us, growing louder with every step until it felt like it was right on top of us. We didn't stop until we reached another clearing, far from where we'd set our trap. A clearing surrounded by ancient stone structures that looked like they'd been there for centuries. "What is this place?" Jeremy asked breathlessly as he scanned our surroundings. I shook my head. "I don't know, but whatever's happening here started here." Jeremy and I stood in the clearing, breathing hard. The ancient stone structures around us looked like something out of a history book, weathered and cracked, covered in moss and vines. They were arranged in a strange pattern, almost like they were marking something important. The air felt colder here, heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. "What is this place?" Jeremy asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "I don't know, but it's not on any map I've seen." We scanned the area with our flashlights, but the shadows seemed thicker here, refusing to be pushed back by the light. My gut told me we weren't alone. Something was watching us from the darkness. Jeremy stepped closer to one of the stone structures and ran his fingers over the carvings etched into its surface. They looked similar to the markings we'd seen on the trees earlier, circles and lines arranged in patterns that didn't make any sense. "Do you think this has something to do with whatever that thing is?" he asked nervously. "Maybe," I said quietly. "But we need to keep moving. It's not safe here." Just as I turned to leave, I heard it again, the whispering. It was faint at first, like it was coming from far away, but then it grew louder, closer. "Do you hear that?" Jeremy asked, his voice shaking. I nodded and tightened my grip on my flashlight. "Stay close." The whispering surrounded us now, coming from every direction at once. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping and echoing through the trees like a chorus of nightmares. "Thomas," one of the voices called softly. I froze in place. It sounded familiar, too familiar. "Thomas," it called again, louder this time. I turned sharply toward the sound and saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. At first glance, it looked like one of my old smoke jumper teammates from years ago. Named Miguel, who had died in a wildfire we couldn't contain. "Miguel," I whispered before I could stop myself. The figure stepped closer into the moonlight, its face pale and hollow-eyed like the creature we'd seen earlier, but its features were unmistakably Miguel's. "You left me," it said softly, its voice filled with pain. "No," I stammered, shaking my head. "No, I tried to save you." "You left me," it repeated, stepping closer still. Jeremy grabbed my arm suddenly and pulled me back toward one of the stone structures. "Thomas, that's not real!" I blinked hard and shook my head again as if trying to clear my mind. When I looked back toward where Miguel had been standing, he was gone, but the whispering hadn't stopped. Now it was Jeremy's turn to freeze in place as another figure appeared near one of the stones. A woman who looked like his mother. "Jeremy," she called softly. He let go of my arm and stepped toward her slowly, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Mom?" "Jeremy," she repeated, her voice filled with sorrow. "It's not her," I said firmly as I grabbed his arm again. "It's not real." Jeremy shook his head as tears filled his eyes. But it looks like her." "It's not her," I repeated more forcefully this time. "It's trying to mess with us." The whispering grew louder now, almost deafening as more figures appeared around us, people from our pasts who shouldn't be here. Their faces were twisted versions of themselves, pale and hollow-eyed, like the creature we'd seen earlier. "It's playing tricks on us," I said urgently as I pulled Jeremy toward the trail leading out of the clearing. "We need to get out of here." We stumbled through the darkness, our flashlights barely cutting through the thick shadows that seemed to follow us wherever we went. The whispering didn't stop. It followed us relentlessly, growing louder with every step until it felt like it was inside our heads. By the time we reached another trailhead leading back toward the ranger station, Jeremy was shaking uncontrollably. His face was pale and his breathing was shallow. "They're not real," he muttered over and over again, like he was trying to convince himself. "They're not real," I echoed quietly as I scanned our surroundings for any sign of movement. But deep down, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was lurking in those woods wasn't just hunting us, it was trying to break us. The trail back to the ranger station felt endless. Every step we took seemed heavier, like the forest was trying to pull us back. The whispering had stopped, but the silence that replaced it wasn't any better. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like something was waiting just out of sight. Jeremy walked beside me, his flashlight shaking in his hand. He hadn't said much since we left the clearing, but I could tell he was barely holding it together. I didn't blame him. I wasn't doing much better. "We're almost there," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to reassure him or myself. When we finally reached the ranger station, it looked different somehow. Darker, even with the porch light on. The windows were fogged up like someone had been breathing on them from the outside. "Do you think Jack and Diane made it back?" Jeremy asked hesitantly. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we need to check." We stepped onto the porch slowly, our boots creaking against the wooden planks. I reached for the door handle and paused, my heart pounding in my chest. Something didn't feel right. "Stay behind me," I told Jeremy as I pushed the door open. The inside of the station was eerily quiet. The lights were still on, but everything felt off. Papers were scattered across the floor, chairs were overturned, and Jack's radio was lying in pieces on the table. "Jack? Diane?" I called out cautiously. No answer. Jeremy stepped closer. To me, his eyes darting around nervously. "Where are they?" Before I could respond, we heard a loud thud coming from one of the back rooms. My grip tightened on my flashlight as I motioned for Jeremy to stay put. I moved toward the sound slowly, my heart racing with every step. When I reached the door to the supply room, I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The room was empty, at least at first glance, but something caught my eye near the corner, a trail of muddy footprints leading toward one of the shelves. "Thomas." Jeremy's voice called softly from behind me. I turned around quickly and saw him standing in the doorway, his face pale. "What is it?" I asked. He pointed toward one of the windows near the far wall. "Look." I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Outside, just beyond the edge of the clearing, stood a figure watching us. It was tall and thin like before, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "It's here," Jeremy whispered. Before either of us could react, there was another loud thud, this time from above us. It sounded like something heavy had landed on the roof. "We need to go," I said urgently as I grabbed Jeremy's arm and pulled him toward the door. But before we could reach it, another figure appeared in front of us, blocking our path. At first glance, it looked like Jack, but his movements were wrong again, too smooth and deliberate like before. "Jack?" Jeremy asked hesitantly. The figure tilted its head slowly before stepping closer to us. Its grin widened unnaturally as its hollow eyes locked onto mine. "It's not him," I said firmly as I pulled Jeremy back toward another door leading outside. We burst out into the night air and ran toward the tree line without looking back. The forest felt alive again, branches reaching out toward us like they were trying to grab us as we ran. When we finally stopped to catch our breath near another clearing, Jeremy collapsed onto his knees, gasping for air. "What do we do now?" he asked desperately. I didn't have an answer, not this time. Not. The trap we'd set earlier had been our best shot at stopping whatever this thing was, but now it felt like it was 2 steps ahead of us at every turn. As we sat there trying to figure out our next move, I noticed something strange about the clearing we were in. It looked familiar somehow. "This is where it started," I said quietly. Jeremy looked up at me with wide eyes. "What do you mean?" I pointed toward one of the trees near the edge of the clearing. The same tree where we'd found those strange carvings earlier. This is where we found those markings, I explained. Whatever this thing is, it's tied to this place. Jeremy nodded slowly as he stood up again. So what do we do? I took a deep breath and tightened my grip on my flashlight. We end this. Jeremy and I stood in the clearing, surrounded by the strange carvings on the trees and the ancient stone structures. The air felt heavier here, colder, like it was pressing down on us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I tightened my grip on my flashlight. This is it, I said quietly. Whatever this thing is, it's tied to this place. Jeremy nodded slowly, his face pale but determined. How do we stop it? I didn't have a clear answer. Everything about this creature, the way it moved, the way it played with our minds, was unlike anything I'd ever encountered before. But one thing was clear, it wasn't just hunting us, it was feeding off our fear. We need to stay calm, I said firmly. It wants us to panic. If we keep our heads, maybe we can outsmart it. Jeremy swallowed hard and nodded again. All right. We started moving carefully through the clearing, scanning every shadow for any sign of movement. The carvings on the trees seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight now, their patterns twisting and shifting like they were alive. Do you think these markings mean something? Jeremy asked quietly. Maybe, I replied. They're too deliberate to be random. As we stepped closer to one of the stone structures, I noticed something strange. There was a large reflective surface embedded in its center, almost like a mirror. It was cracked and weathered, but still caught the moonlight in a way that made it stand out. What's this? Jeremy asked as he crouched down to examine it. I shook my head. I don't know, but it might be important. Before we could investigate further, we heard it, a low growling sound coming from somewhere nearby. It was soft at first, almost like it was carried on the wind, but then it grew louder, closer. It's here, Jeremy whispered. I turned toward the sound and saw the creature stepping into view from the shadows. It looked taller now, more twisted, its hollow eyes glowing faintly as it locked onto us. Stay calm, I said quietly as I grabbed Jeremy's arm. Don't let it mess with your head. The creature tilted its head slowly before stepping closer to us. Its movements were jerky again, unnatural like before, but this time there was something different about it. It wasn't just watching us, it was studying us. It knows we're trying to stop it, Jeremy said nervously. Good, I replied firmly. Let's give it a reason to be scared. I grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it toward one of the carvings on the trees. The moment the rock hit the bark, the creature let out an ear-piercing screech that echoed through the clearing. It's connected to these markings, Jeremy shouted. Keep going, I yelled back as I grabbed another rock and threw it toward another tree. The creature screeched again and lunged toward us, but stopped suddenly when its reflection caught in the mirror-like surface of the stone structure. It froze in place, its hollow eyes locking onto its own distorted image. For a moment, it looked confused, like it didn't understand what it was seeing. This is its weakness, I shouted as I grabbed Jeremy's arm and pulled him toward another stone structure with a similar reflective surface. The creature screeched again and lunged at us, but each time its reflection caught in one of the mirrors, it stopped abruptly, as if paralyzed by its own image. We need to trap it, Jeremy yelled over the sound of its screeches. I nodded and motioned for him to grab one of the ropes we'd brought earlier. Together, we rigged a makeshift barrier around one of the larger mirrors using branches and rope, forcing the creature to confront its reflection directly. As soon as we finished setting up the trap, the creature lunged toward us again, but this time its movements were slower, more hesitant, as if it knew what was coming. When it reached the mirror-like surface, its distorted image seemed to ripple across the glass, splitting into multiple versions of itself that began fighting each other violently. What's happening? Jeremy asked breathlessly. It's turning on itself. The creature stood frozen in front of the cracked mirror embedded in the stone. Its hollow eyes stared at its reflection, and for the first time it looked unsettled. The distorted image in the mirror seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. Then something strange happened. The creature's reflection didn't. Just stay still. It moved on its own. What's happening? Jeremy whispered, his voice trembling. I don't know, I said, my eyes locked on the scene in front of us. But whatever it is, it doesn't like it. The reflection in the mirror began to twist and shift, splitting into multiple versions of the creature. Each version looked slightly different. Some taller, some shorter, some with even more jagged features. They seemed to be fighting each other inside the glass, clawing and screeching like wild animals. The creature outside the mirror let out a deafening screech and stumbled backward, its movements jerky and frantic. It was like it couldn't handle what it was seeing. This is its weakness, I said firmly, gripping Jeremy's shoulder. It can't face itself. Jeremy nodded quickly. What do we do now? We need to keep it here, I said. Force it to stay in front of the mirror. The creature clawed at its own face now, as if trying to tear away whatever part of itself was being reflected back at it. Its movements were desperate, almost panicked, for something that had hunted us so relentlessly. Seeing it like this was unsettling. Help me move this, I said, pointing to a large branch lying nearby. Jeremy, and I dragged the branch toward the stone structure with the mirror. We used it to block one side of the clearing, creating a barrier that would force the creature to stay near the reflective surface. As we worked, the creature let out another ear-piercing screech and lunged toward us. But this time, its movements were slower, weaker. It was like being near the mirror was draining it somehow. Thomas! Jeremy shouted as he pointed toward another tree. I turned and saw more of those strange carvings glowing faintly on its bark. The patterns seemed to pulse with light, almost like they were alive. It's connected to those markings, Jeremy said urgently. We need to destroy them. Without hesitation, I grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at the tree. The moment the rock struck one of the carvings, the light dimmed slightly, and the creature let out another screech of pain. It's working! Jeremy yelled. We moved quickly now, throwing rocks and using sticks to scrape away as many of the carvings as we could find. Each time we destroyed one, the creature grew weaker, its movements slower and more erratic. But then something changed. The forest around us seemed to come alive again. The trees creaked and groaned as if they were moving on their own. The air grew colder, and that heavy silence returned, pressing down on us like a weight. It's trying to stop us, I said through gritted teeth. Jeremy nodded but didn't slow down. He grabbed a large stick and began hacking away at one of the trees with all his strength. We're almost there, he shouted. The creature stumbled toward us again, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It reached out with one clawed hand, but before it could get any closer, its reflection in the mirror rippled violently again. This time, something different happened. The distorted versions of itself inside the glass began pulling at each other, tearing each other apart piece by piece until there was nothing left but darkness. The creature outside the mirror let out one final screech, a sound so loud and piercing that I had to cover my ears, and then collapsed onto the ground. For a moment, everything was still. Is it over? Jeremy asked hesitantly. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stepped closer to where the creature had fallen, its twisted body lying motionless on the ground near the stone structure. Its hollow eyes stared up at me lifelessly now, but something about them still felt wrong. We need to go, I said finally, as I turned back toward Jeremy. Now! He didn't argue. We grabbed our gear and started making our way back toward the trailhead as quickly as we could. The forest felt different now, quieter somehow, but not in a comforting way. It was like whatever had been controlling it was gone. But something else had taken its place. By the time we reached the edge of the forest and saw the faint glow of dawn breaking over the horizon, Neither of us spoke a word. We didn't need to. What we'd just been through didn't feel real enough to talk about yet, but deep down, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever that thing had been, whatever had been lurking in those woods, it wasn't just gone. It was waiting for someone else to find it. The sun was rising by the time Jeremy and I made it back to the ranger station. The soft light of dawn painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, but it didn't feel peaceful, not after everything we'd been through. The forest behind us still felt alive somehow, like it was watching us leave. The station was eerily quiet when we stepped inside. The overturned chairs and scattered papers were still there, but there was no sign of Jack or Diane. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. Jeremy slumped into one of the chairs at the table, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. "Do you think they made it out?" he asked quietly. I didn't have an answer. I wanted to believe they were okay, that they'd somehow found another way out of the woods, but after what we'd seen, I couldn't be sure of anything anymore. "We'll report it," I said finally, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We'll tell them everything." Jeremy nodded slowly, but didn't say anything else. He just stared down at his hands, like he was trying to process everything that had happened. I grabbed the radio from the table and tried to call for help again, but the signal was still weak, just static on the other end. It felt like the forest didn't want us to tell anyone what had happened, like it was trying to keep its secrets hidden. Eventually, we decided to hike down to the nearest town ourselves. It wasn't far, just a few miles, but every step felt heavier than the last. The weight of what we'd seen, what we'd survived, hung over us like a dark cloud. When we finally reached the town and reported everything to the authorities, their reactions were exactly what I expected. Skepticism mixed with concern. They sent a search team into the forest later that day, but when they came back, they said they didn't find anything unusual. No carvings on trees, no stone structures, no sign of Jack or Diane. "It's like it never happened," Jeremy said quietly. As we sat on a bench outside the sheriff's office, I nodded but didn't say anything. Deep down, I knew better. Just because they didn't find anything didn't mean it wasn't real. A few weeks later, I decided to resign from my job as a ranger. I couldn't go back into those woods, not after what I'd seen. Jeremy quit too. He said he couldn't even look at a forest without feeling like something was watching him. I moved to a small town far away from Sequoia National Forest and tried to start over. For a while, things were quiet, normal even. But that uneasy feeling never really went away. Every now and then, I'd catch myself staring out my window at night, half expecting to see those hollow eyes watching me from the shadows. Sometimes I'd hear faint whispers in my dreams, voices calling my name in that same low, guttural tone. And then one night, months after everything had happened, I found something outside my cabin that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the dirt leading up to my porch. They were long and thin with claw-like toes, just like the ones we'd seen in the forest. I stared at them for a long time before finally stepping back inside and locking every door and window in my cabin. My hands were shaking as I sat down at the table and tried to calm myself. "It's over," I whispered aloud, trying to convince myself. "It's over." But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Whatever had been lurking in those woods wasn't gone. It had just followed me home. My name is Douglas Harrison, and I've been a park ranger for over 15 years. I've seen just about everything nature has to offer: majestic sunsets, dangerous wildlife, and even the occasional lost hiker who swears they saw Bigfoot. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened in Timber Ridge Wilderness Area. Timber Ridge is unlike any other place I've worked. It's remote, tucked away in the far reaches of Washington state, surrounded by towering evergreens that seem to stretch endlessly into the sky. The air always feels heavy there, like the forest is holding its breath. Locals call it the Watcher's territory, but most people laugh it off as folklore. Just another spooky story to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. I never believed in those stories, at least not until last summer. It all started when I was assigned to lead a team into Timber Ridge to investigate strange wildlife patterns. Animals had been disappearing, entire herds of deer, packs of wolves, and no one could figure out why. Joining me on this trip were Dr. Monica Reynolds, a wildlife biologist who was as sharp as she was stubborn, Jack Peterson, a rugged local guide who knew the area like the back of his hand, Marcus Chen, a graduate student eager to prove himself, and Deputy Diana Morris, sent along for safety since Timber Ridge had a history of missing persons. We were supposed to spend 2 weeks in the wilderness collecting data and figuring out what was going on. Simple enough, right? But from the moment we arrived, something felt wrong. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Forests are never truly quiet. You hear birds chirping, leaves rustling, maybe the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. But Timber Ridge was dead silent, like the whole place had been frozen in time. Even Jack, who had spent years guiding people through these woods, looked uneasy. "This isn't normal," he muttered as we set up camp near the edge of the forest. Not normal at all. I brushed it off at first. Maybe we were just tired from the long drive or spooked by the eerie reputation of the place. But then little things started happening, things we couldn't explain. Our equipment would be rearranged overnight, even though no one admitted to touching it. We heard rhythmic knocking sounds in the distance, like someone or something was signaling us from deep within the woods. Monica tried to stay logical about it all. "Probably just wind or animals," she said every time something strange happened. But I could see it in her eyes. She didn't believe her own words. By the third night, even Marcus was starting to crack jokes about ghosts and monsters just to lighten the mood. "Maybe we'll be famous," he said with a grin. "The first, and people to prove Bigfoot is real." Jack didn't laugh. He just stared into the darkness beyond our campfire and said quietly, "You don't want to meet what's out there." I should have listened to him. The next morning we packed up and headed deeper into the forest. Our mission was simple: set up observation points, collect data on wildlife activity, and try to figure out why Timber Ridge had suddenly gone so quiet. But as we moved further in, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees were taller and thicker, their branches twisting together like they were trying to block out the sky. Jack led the way, his machete slicing through overgrown brush. "Stay close," he warned. "This place has a way of turning people around." He wasn't kidding. The trails were barely visible, and every path looked the same. Endless trees, moss-covered rocks, and shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. Even with GPS devices and maps, it felt like the forest was playing tricks on us. By midday, we reached a small clearing where we decided to set up our base camp. It wasn't much, just a few tents, a portable stove, and some basic equipment. But it felt like a safe spot compared to the dense woods around us. As we unpacked, Monica pulled out her notebook and started jotting down observations. "No bird calls," she said aloud. "No signs of deer or elk tracks either." She glanced at me and added, "It's like this place is empty." I nodded, but didn't say anything. She was right. There was something unnatural about the silence here. Even the wind seemed to avoid Timber Ridge. That night, as we sat around the campfire eating canned soup and crackers, Marcus tried to lighten the mood again. "So," he said with a grin, "what's scarier, ghosts or bears?" "Ghosts," Monica replied without hesitation. "Bears are predictable." Jack didn't join in on the banter. He just stared into the fire and muttered, "You don't want to meet what's out here." His words hung in the air like smoke from the fire. No one knew how to respond, so we sat in silence for a while before heading to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night to an odd sound, a faint tapping noise coming from somewhere outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just a branch hitting against something in the wind. But when I listened closer, I realized it wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone knocking on wood in a pattern. I unzipped my tent slowly and peeked out into the darkness. The campfire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows across the clearing. I couldn't see anything unusual, but the tapping continued. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more knocks. A pause. Douglas! Monica's voice startled me from behind as she stepped out of her tent. Her face was pale in the dim light of her flashlight. "Do you hear that?" I nodded and whispered back, "Stay close." We walked toward the edge of the clearing where the sound seemed to be coming from, but as soon as we got close enough to see into the trees, it stopped, like whoever or whatever had been making it knew we were there. Jack joined us moments later, his rifle slung over his shoulder and his face grim. "Get back to camp," he ordered quietly. "You, now." We didn't argue. The next morning the forest felt different. The air was colder and the shadows seemed darker, even though the sun was shining. We tried to focus on our work, setting up wildlife cameras, collecting soil samples, and marking areas for observation. But it was hard to shake the feeling that we were being watched. Jack kept glancing over his shoulder as he guided us through the woods. "Stay alert," he said. "This place doesn't like visitors." Monica rolled her eyes but didn't argue. She was too focused on her research, scribbling notes in her journal every few minutes. Marcus, on the other hand, seemed distracted. He kept stopping to look around, like he was trying to catch something just out of sight. By midday, we found something strange, a massive footprint in the mud near a stream. It was bigger than any animal track I'd ever seen, at least twice. The size of a bear's paw. The edges were sharp, like whatever made it had claws instead of toes. "What kind of animal leaves tracks like this?" Marcus asked, crouching down to get a closer look. Monica shook her head. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's not in any of my field guides." Jack didn't say anything. He just stared at the footprint for a long time before muttering, "We shouldn't be here." We marked the spot and moved on, but the discovery left us all uneasy. As we continued deeper into the forest, we started noticing more signs. Trees snapped in half at impossible heights, claw marks on rocks that looked like they'd been gouged out by something strong enough to crush stone, and patches of ground where the grass had been torn up in circles. By late afternoon, Monica decided to set up one of her wildlife cameras near an area where we found several broken branches and scattered bones. "If something's out here," she said, "this should help us figure out what it is." As she adjusted the camera, Marcus wandered off to explore a nearby ridge. "I'll be right back," he called over his shoulder. "Don't go too far." I shouted after him, but he was already out of sight. 20 minutes passed before we realized Marcus hadn't returned. Jack and I went looking for him, while Monica stayed behind to finish setting up her equipment. We followed his tracks up the ridge but stopped short when we saw what was waiting for us at the top. A pile of shredded clothing and broken equipment scattered across the ground. "Marcus!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest as I scanned the area for any sign of him. Jack crouched down and picked up one of Marcus's boots. It was torn apart and there was blood on it. He held it up silently before tossing it aside with a grim expression. "We need to get back to camp," Jack said firmly. "Now!" I wanted to keep searching for Marcus. I couldn't just leave him out there. But Jack grabbed my arm and pulled me back down the ridge. "You don't understand," he said urgently. "If we stay out here any longer, none of us are making it back alive." When we returned to camp without Marcus, Monica looked at us with wide eyes and asked, "Where is he?" Jack shook his head and said quietly, "He's gone." That night, none of us slept. The night after Marcus disappeared was the longest night of my life. The 3 of us, Monica, Jack and I, sat huddled around the campfire, barely speaking. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made us jump. The forest felt alive, like it was watching us, waiting for something. Monica was the first to break the silence. "We can't just leave him out there," she said, her voice trembling. "What if he's hurt? What if he's—" She trailed, off, unable to finish her sentence. Jack shook his head firmly. "Marcus is gone," he said flatly. "Whatever took him isn't going to give him back." I wanted to argue, to tell Jack he was wrong, but deep down I knew he was right. The blood on Marcus's boot and the shredded gear we found, it wasn't the work of an ordinary predator. Whatever was out there wasn't just hunting, it was sending a message. We decided to stay put until morning and then head back to the trailhead to call for help. But as the hours dragged on, it became clear that we weren't alone. It started with the knocking again, 3 sharp raps on wood, coming from somewhere in the darkness. Then another set of knocks, this time closer. Monica clutched her flashlight tightly and whispered, "What is that?" Jack stood up slowly, his rifle in hand. "Stay by the fire," he ordered. "Don't move." I grabbed my own flashlight and scanned the trees, but I couldn't see anything beyond the flickering glow of the flames. The knocking continued, growing louder and more erratic, like whatever was making the sound wanted us to know it was there. Then we heard it, a low guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was deep and resonant, almost like it came from something too big to be real. "Get in the tents," Jack hissed, his voice low but urgent. "Now!" Monica and I scrambled into one of the tents, while Jack stood guard outside with his rifle. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Monica was shaking beside me, clutching her knees to her chest as she whispered over and over, "This isn't happening. This isn't happening." The growling grew closer, accompanied by heavy footsteps that seemed to shake the ground beneath us. Whatever it wasn't afraid of us or our fire. Suddenly, there was a deafening crash as something slammed into one of the tents. Monica screamed as we tumbled backwards, struggling to get out of its path. Jack fired his rifle into the air, and for a moment everything went silent again. "Stay down," Jack shouted as he backed toward our tent, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. I peeked out just in time to see a massive figure retreating into the darkness, a hulking shape covered in matted fur that moved with an unnatural speed and grace for something so large. It didn't look like a bear or any other animal I'd ever seen before. It looked wrong somehow, like it didn't belong in this world. "It's testing us," Jack muttered under his breath as he reloaded his rifle, "seeing what we'll do." We spent the rest of the night huddled together by the fire, too scared to sleep or even speak much. Whatever that thing was, it didn't come back, but we could feel its presence lingering just beyond the light of our campfire. When dawn finally broke, we packed up what little gear we had left and started making our way back toward the trailhead as fast as we could manage without getting lost again. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. We didn't talk much as we hiked back toward the trailhead. The forest was still unnervingly quiet, and every step felt heavier than the last. Monica kept glancing over her shoulder, her face pale and drawn. Jack led the way, his rifle ready, while I stayed close behind, gripping my flashlight like it was some kind of weapon. After hours of walking, we stumbled upon something unexpected, a series of carvings etched into the bark of several trees. They were old, weathered by time and nature, but still clear enough to make out. Strange symbols, almost like pictographs, spiraled up the trunks in patterns that didn't make any sense to me. "What is this?" Monica asked, stepping closer. "To examine one of the carvings." Jack's face darkened as he studied them. "Warnings," he said quietly. "The locals talk about these. They say they were left by the tribes who used to live here, long before settlers came." "Warnings about what?" I asked. Jack hesitated before answering. "They called them the Watchers, said they were protectors of the forest, but also something to be feared." Monica frowned, running her fingers over one of the symbols. Protectors? Protecting what? Jack shrugged. No one knows. Most people think it's just a story. He paused and looked around uneasily. But after what we've seen, maybe it's not. We decided to take a closer look at the area around the carvings, hoping to find some kind of clue about what was happening in Timber Ridge. That's when we discovered the cave. It was hidden, behind a thick curtain of moss and vines, almost invisible unless you were standing right in front of it. The entrance was narrow and dark, with jagged rocks forming an archway that looked like a mouth frozen mid-scream. This doesn't feel right, Jack muttered as he peered inside. But Monica was already pulling out her flashlight. Curiosity, overriding her fear. We have to see what's in there, she said firmly. It might explain everything. Reluctantly, we followed her into the cave. The air inside was damp and cold, carrying a faint metallic smell that made my stomach churn. The walls were covered in more carvings, similar to the ones on the trees outside, but far more detailed and intricate. They depicted strange figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, standing over smaller human-like shapes, almost like they were guarding them or hunting them. As we ventured deeper, we found piles of bones scattered across the floor. Animal bones at first, but then others that looked disturbingly human. Monica knelt down to examine one of the skulls, her hands trembling as she picked it up. "These are old," she whispered. "Really old." Jack kept his rifle raised as he scanned the shadows ahead of us. "We shouldn't be here," he said again, his voice tight with tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not just by whatever had taken Marcus, but by something older and more dangerous than any of us could understand. When we finally emerged from the cave into daylight again, Monica looked shaken but determined. "This isn't just some random predator," she said firmly. "There's something intelligent out here, something that doesn't want us here." Jack nodded grimly and turned to me. "We need to set up defenses tonight," he said. "If it comes back, we need to be ready." Back at camp, we worked quickly to prepare for nightfall. Jack rigged up a perimeter alarm using fishing line and empty cans, while Monica focused on reviewing the footage from her wildlife cameras, what little we had left after our gear had been destroyed. That evening, as darkness fell once again over Timber Ridge, we sat by the fire with weapons close. At hand and nerves stretched thin as wire, whatever was out there. It wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. Night fell faster than any of us expected, and the forest seemed to swallow the last traces of daylight. The fire crackled weakly in the center of our camp, but its light felt small and fragile against the overwhelming darkness surrounding us. Jack's makeshift perimeter alarm hung in place, a thin line of fishing wire tied to cans that would rattle if anything crossed it. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Monica sat close to the fire, her laptop open as she reviewed the footage from her wildlife cameras. "It's static," she muttered, frustration clear in her voice. "All of it, just static." "What does that mean?" I asked, leaning closer to see the screen. She shook her head. "I don't know. It's like something's interfering with the signal." She paused and looked up at me, her face pale in the flickering light. "Whatever's out there, it doesn't want us to see it." Jack was pacing near the edge of camp, his rifle slung over his shoulder and his flashlight sweeping across the trees. "Keep your eyes open," he warned. "If it comes back, we won't have much time to react." Deputy Morris hadn't said much since Marcus disappeared. She was sitting quietly by her tent, her hand resting on her holstered pistol as she stared into the darkness. I couldn't tell if she was scared or just trying to keep herself together. But either way, she didn't look like she trusted this forest any more than the rest of us did. The first sign of trouble came just after midnight. The cans rattled, sharply, breaking the tense silence and sending all of us scrambling to our feet. Jack raised his rifle and aimed toward the sound, while Monica grabbed her flashlight and pointed it into the trees. "Stay close," Jack ordered, his voice low but firm. For a moment, nothing happened, just the sound of our breathing and the faint crackle of the fire behind us. Then we heard it again, heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush, slow and deliberate like something was circling us. Over there, Monica whispered urgently, pointing toward a shadow that moved between two trees. Jack fired a warning shot into the air, but whatever was out there didn't flinch. It just stopped for a moment before continuing its slow approach. I gripped my flashlight tightly and scanned the area, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. That's when I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness, unblinking and eerily calm. They were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal, at least 7 feet up, and they seemed to shimmer like they were reflecting light that wasn't even there. "It's watching us," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. Jack fired another shot, this time aiming toward the glowing eyes, but as soon as he did, they vanished into the shadows like smoke, dissipating in the wind. "That's not an animal," Monica said quietly, her voice trembling as she backed closer to me and Jack. "It's something else." The growling started again, low and guttural at first, but growing louder and more aggressive with each passing second. The footsteps quickened too, moving around us in erratic patterns like whatever was out there was trying to confuse us or wear us down. Then came another sound, a sharp snap, followed by a loud crash as one of our tents collapsed under what looked like a massive weight pressing down on it from above. Deputy Morris drew her pistol and fired blindly into the darkness while shouting for whatever was out there to back off, but her shots didn't seem to do anything except make it angrier. The growling turned into snarling now, deep and guttural noises that made my stomach churn, and I realized we weren't dealing with one creature anymore. There were more. The snarling grew louder, coming from all directions. It felt like the forest itself was alive, closing in on us with every passing second. Jack shouted for us to stay close to the fire, his rifle raised as he scanned the shadows. Monica was trembling beside me, clutching her flashlight like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Deputy Morris fired another shot into the darkness, but it didn't help. Whatever was out there wasn't scared of us or our weapons. "We can't stay here," Monica cried, panic breaking through her voice. "They're going to tear us apart." Jack gritted his teeth and shook his head. "If we run, they'll pick us off one by one. We have to hold our ground." I wanted to believe him, but the fear in his eyes told me he wasn't as confident as he sounded. Then, just as I thought the creatures were going to charge at us, everything went quiet again. The growling stopped, the footsteps faded, and the forest returned to its eerie silence. "What's happening?" Monica whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack didn't answer right away. He lowered his rifle slightly and took a cautious step toward the edge of the clearing. "I don't know," he admitted, "but don't let your guard down." That's when we saw it, another set of carvings etched into a large rock near the edge of camp. They were similar to the ones we'd found earlier, but more detailed and intricate, almost like they were telling a story. Monica stepped closer to examine them, her flashlight illuminating the strange symbols. "This is different," she said, quietly. "It's not just warnings, it's instructions." "What kind of instructions?" I asked, my voice shaking as I kept glancing over my shoulder for any sign of movement in the trees. She pointed to one of the carvings, a series of figures arranged in a circle around what looked like a large stone or artifact. "It's like they're protecting something," she explained. "Something important." Jack frowned and stepped closer to the rock, his rifle still ready. "Protecting what?" Monica hesitated before answering. "I don't know," she admitted. "But whatever it is, I think that's why they're here." Deputy Morris joined us, her face pale and drawn as she studied the carvings. "You're saying these things aren't just hunting us? They're guarding something?" Monica nodded slowly. "It makes sense," she said. "The disappearances, the strange behavior, it's all connected to whatever they're protecting." "Jack, didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue either. He turned back toward camp and said firmly, "We need to figure out what it is, and fast." We spent the next few hours searching for more clues around the clearing while keeping an eye on the forest for any signs of movement. That's when we found it, a narrow path leading deeper into the woods, marked by more carvings on the trees. "It's a trail," Monica said softly, her flashlight illuminating the symbols as we walked cautiously down the path. The trail led us to another cave, larger than the one we'd found earlier and far more ominous looking. The entrance was wide and jagged, with strange markings etched into the stone around it. "This is it," Monica whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and curiosity. Jack shook his head firmly. "We're not going in there," he said flatly, but Monica was already stepping forward, her flashlight aimed into the darkness ahead. "We don't have a choice," she said quietly. "If we don't figure out what's happening here, none of us are getting out alive." We stood at the mouth of the cave, staring into its pitch-black depths. The air that drifted out was cold and damp, carrying a faint metallic smell that made my stomach turn. Jack tightened his grip on his rifle, his jaw set in a hard line. "This is a bad idea," he muttered. "Whatever's in there, it doesn't want us finding it." Monica ignored him, already stepping forward with her flashlight. "If we don't figure this out, those things will keep coming," she said firmly. "We have to know what they're protecting." Reluctantly, Jack and I followed her into the cave. Deputy Morris stayed behind at the entrance, her pistol drawn and her eyes scanning the forest. "I'll keep watch," she said quietly. "Just don't take too long." The cave was larger than it looked from the outside, with walls that seemed to close in and then expand again as we moved deeper inside. Strange symbols covered every surface, carvings similar to the ones we'd seen outside, but more intricate and unsettling. Some of them looked like eyes, staring at us from every angle. Monica stopped suddenly, her flashlight illuminating a large stone altar in the center of the chamber. It was covered in more carvings, but these were different, sharper, almost violent. In their design, at the center of the altar sat a strange object, a black stone, about the size of a football, smooth and polished like glass. "What is that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Monica stepped closer, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. "It's not natural," she said softly. "It's something else." Jack grabbed her arm before she could touch it. "Don't," he warned. "We don't know what it is or what it'll do." Before Monica could argue, we heard it again, the growling. But this time, it wasn't coming from outside the cave. It was inside with us. My blood ran cold as I turned toward the sound, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The beam of light caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows, something big and fast, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. "Run!" Jack shouted, raising his rifle and firing a shot into the blackness. The sound echoed off the walls, deafening in the confined space. Monica grabbed my arm, and we sprinted back toward the entrance as fast as we could. The growling grew louder, behind us, accompanied by heavy footsteps that shook the ground beneath our feet. When we burst out of the cave into the open air, Deputy Morris was waiting for us, her pistol aimed at the tree line. "What happened?" she demanded. But before we could answer, one of those things appeared at the edge of the clearing. A massive figure covered in matted fur, with glowing eyes and claws that looked sharp enough to tear through steel. Morris fired several shots at it, but they barely seemed to faze it. The creature let out an ear-splitting roar and charged toward us. "Get to camp!" Jack shouted as he fired his rifle again. We ran as fast as we could back to our campsite, but when we got there, it was chaos. 2 more creatures had already torn through our tents and supplies, scattering everything across the clearing. "They're everywhere!" Monica cried as she grabbed one of our remaining flashlights. Jack fired another shot at one of the creatures while shouting for us to grab whatever gear we could carry. "We can't stay here," he yelled over the noise. But before we could move, One of the creatures lunged at Deputy Morris and knocked her to the ground. She screamed as its claws raked across her arm, leaving deep gashes that bled heavily. Jack fired again, hitting the creature square in the chest and forcing it to retreat. But not before it let out another roar that seemed to shake the entire forest. Morris was pale and shaking as I helped her to her feet. "We have to get out of here," she gasped. Jack nodded grimly but didn't say anything as he reloaded his rifle. As we stumbled away from camp into the darkness once again, I couldn't help but feel like we were being herded, pushed toward something even worse than what we'd already faced. We ran blindly through the forest, the creature's growls echoing behind us like a nightmare we couldn't escape. Deputy Morris was barely holding herself together, her arm bleeding heavily from the attack. Jack stayed close to her, his rifle ready, while Monica and I led the way with our flashlights. The forest seemed different now, more twisted, more alive. The trees loomed over us like silent watchers, their branches reaching out as if trying to trap us. Every step felt heavier, every shadow darker. "We can't keep running," Jack shouted as he stopped to catch his breath. "They're driving us somewhere." Monica turned to him, her face pale but determined. "Driving us where?" Jack pointed ahead, his jaw clenched. "To that." I followed his gaze and froze. In front of us was another cave, larger than the ones we'd seen before, its entrance wide and jagged like a gaping mouth. The carvings around it were even more intricate, almost glowing in the faint light of our flashlights. "It's a trap," Jack said firmly. "They want us to go in there." Monica shook her head. "Or maybe it's the only way out," she argued. "If they're protecting something, maybe we can use it against them." Jack looked like he wanted to argue, but before he could say anything, another growl echoed through the trees, closer this time. "We don't have a choice," I said quickly. "We have to go in." With no other options, we stepped into the cave. The air inside was colder than before, carrying that same metallic smell that made my stomach churn. The walls were covered in more carvings, symbols that seemed to shift and change as our flashlights passed over them, almost like they were alive. Deputy Morris stumbled behind us, her breathing ragged as she clutched her injured arm. "I don't feel right," she muttered weakly. "We'll get you out of here," Jack promised, though his voice was strained with worry. As we moved deeper into the cave, we found ourselves in a massive chamber, far larger than anything I'd expected. At the center of the room was another altar, similar to the one we'd seen before, but much larger and more elaborate. The black stone sat at its center, glowing faintly with an unnatural light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Monica stepped forward cautiously, her flashlight aimed at the stone. "This is it," she whispered. "This is what they're protecting." Jack grabbed her arm before she could get too close. "Don't touch it," he warned sharply. "We don't know what it'll do." But before any of us could react further, the growling started again. This time louder and more aggressive than ever before. The creatures emerged from the shadows around us, their glowing eyes fixed on the stone as they moved closer to the altar in slow, deliberate steps. "There's more of them," Jack muttered as he raised his rifle. Monica stared at the creatures in awe and fear. "They're guarding it," she said softly. "Guarding what?" I asked urgently. She turned to me with wide eyes and whispered, "Something ancient, something powerful." Suddenly, Deputy Morris let out a sharp cry and collapsed to the ground, clutching her injured arm as she writhed in pain. "What's happening?" I shouted as I knelt beside her. Her skin was pale and clammy, and her eyes were glazed over like she was slipping into some kind of trance. "She's infected," Monica said quickly as she examined Morris's wound. "Infected with what?" Jack demanded. Monica shook her head helplessly. "I don't know, but it's spreading fast." Before we could do anything to help Morris, one of the creatures lunged toward us with a deafening roar. Jack fired his rifle at it, hitting it square in the chest. But instead of falling back like before, it kept coming. "They're not stopping," Jack shouted as he reloaded his weapon. Monica grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the altar. "The stone!" she cried desperately. "It's connected to them. We have to destroy it." I hesitated for a moment before nodding and stepping toward the altar with Monica by my side. As soon as we touched the stone together, everything changed. The moment Monica and I touched the stone, a blinding light filled the chamber. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It wasn't just bright. It was alive. The light pulsed through the room, illuminating every corner of the cave and forcing the creatures to stop in their tracks. They let out guttural howls, covering their glowing eyes as if the light was burning them. I felt a strange sensation coursing through me, like a deep vibration that resonated in my chest and head. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming, like I was standing too close to something far more powerful than I could comprehend. "Douglas!" Monica shouted, her voice barely audible over the hum of the light. "We have to destroy it." I nodded, though I had no idea how we were supposed to destroy something that felt so untouchable. The stone seemed to pulse faster now, as if responding to our presence. The carvings on the walls glowed brighter, and the air grew heavier. With each passing second, Jack fired another shot at one of the creatures, but it barely flinched. "Whatever you're doing, do it fast," he yelled as he backed toward us, his rifle trembling in his hands. Monica grabbed a large rock from the ground and raised it above her head. "Help me!" she shouted. I didn't hesitate. Together, we slammed the rock down onto the black stone with all our strength. The impact sent a shockwave through the chamber, knocking us both back and causing the creatures to let out an ear-splitting roar. The stone cracked slightly, but didn't break completely. The light flickered for a moment before growing even brighter, almost blinding us entirely. "Again!" Monica cried as she scrambled to her feet. We raised the rock again and brought it down with everything we had. This time, the stone shattered into pieces, sending shards flying across the room like glass. The light exploded outward in a final burst before disappearing entirely, plunging the cave into darkness. For a moment, everything was silent. No growling, no footsteps, no hum of energy. Just silence. "Is it over?" I whispered, my voice shaky and uncertain. Jack's flashlight clicked on, illuminating the chamber once again. The creatures were gone, vanished as if they'd never been there at all. The carvings on the walls had faded too, leaving only faint outlines behind. Monica let out a shaky breath and collapsed onto her knees beside me. "We did it," she said softly, though her voice was filled with exhaustion rather than triumph. But then we heard it, a low rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. "What now?" Jack muttered as he helped Deputy Morris to her feet. The ground beneath us began to shake violently, sending rocks tumbling from the ceiling of the cave. "It's collapsing!" Monica shouted as she grabbed my arm. "We have to get out of here!" We ran as fast as we could toward the entrance of the cave, dodging falling debris and trying not to trip over the uneven ground. The rumbling grew louder with each step we took, like the entire forest was being torn apart from below. When we finally burst out into the open air, we didn't stop running until we were far away from the cave entrance. Behind us, the ground caved in completely, sealing off whatever had been inside forever. We collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping for breath and trying to process what had just happened. Deputy Morris was pale and weak, but still alive, though her wound looked worse than ever. "We need to get her help," Jack said firmly, as he reloaded his rifle one last time. Monica nodded silently, but didn't say anything as she stared back toward where the cave had been. It took us 2 days to make it back to civilization. Deputy Morris was rushed to a hospital where doctors treated her for an infection they couldn't explain, one that left scars on her arm that never fully healed. When we tried to report what had happened in Timber Ridge Wilderness area, no one believed us. They said we were suffering from stress-induced delusions caused by isolation and fear, but Monica and I knew better, and so did Jack. We never spoke about it again after that, not really. But sometimes I catch myself thinking about those glowing eyes in the darkness, or that strange black stone pulsing with energy. Timber Ridge is closed now, officially due to unstable geological conditions. But every now and then, people still go missing in those woods, and sometimes late at night. I wonder if the Watchers found somewhere else to guard.